Conscious leaders put people first, but so do conscious companies. I spent 7 years of my life working at Skyrun Aspen, always joking that it was my public service subsidy. And they walk this. During COVID, Skyrun helped short-term rentals transition to long-term housing so locals had a place to stay and owners could keep their homes. And when the time was right, they helped us shift right back as a community. If you're looking for a vacation rental company that leads with care, then Skyrun is it. To experience their commitment to community and care in Colorado, use code HOP15, that's Healing Our Politics 15, for 15% off a stay. Whether for yourself or someone in your community, check the link in the show notes for more.
Hello, my name is Skippy Mesereau, coach, former elected official, and lifetime public servant. Welcome to Healing Our Politics, the show that shows you, the heart-centered public servant and political leader, how to heal our politics by starting with the human in the mirror. It is my job to sit down or stand up with the best experts in all areas of human development, thought leaders, coaches, therapists, authors, scientists, and more, to take the best of what they have learned and translate it specifically for the public service experience, providing you actionable, practical, tactical tools that you can test out today in your life and with your teams. I will also talk to leaders across the globe with a self-care practice, getting to know them at a deeply human and personal level so that you can learn from their challenges and journey. Warning, this is a post-partisan space. Yes, I have a bias. You have a bias. We all have a bias. Everybody gets a bias. And I will be stripping out all of the unconscious cues of bias from this space. No politics, partisanship, or policy here. Because well-being belongs to all of us. And we will all be better served if every human in leadership, regardless of party, ideology, race, or geography, are happier, healthier, and more connected. This show is about resourcing you, the human doing leadership, and trusting you to make up your own damn mind about what to do with it and what's best for your community. So, as always, with love, here we go.
Welcome to the Healing Our Politics podcast, the show that shows you, the heart-centered leader, how to heal our politics by starting with that human in the mirror. You know that face. In today's episode, I sit down with expert in indomitable leadership. My words, not his, Mr. Rick Doblin. Who is Rick? Rick is a 2024 Time Health 100 honoree. What does that mean? He is one of the 100 most influential people in global health, period. He's the founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and simply put, the man who has done the impossible. Starting in his 20s, before I was even born, Rick had the vision to restore and reimagine the relationship between psychedelic medicines and society as a legitimate healing force. At the time, this was so far from possible, it was to be laughable. Psychedelic medicines were in the crosshairs of the Nixon White House, and this was the peak of the drug war. But for over 4 decades, with relentless will and joyful persistence that has never left him, Rick has turned that dream into one of the most important movements in global mental health today. The results? Nothing short of extraordinary. Psychedelic medicines are now vastly outperforming traditional pharmacological interventions for a variety of conditions like depression, addiction, anxiety, OCD, cluster headaches, and more in clinical trials, often without the long-term side effects or ongoing medication needs. These outcomes have led to rare bipartisan support from across the political spectrum. Who could have imagined, at the height of the drug war, that psychedelics would become one of the few things capable of uniting a politically fractured nation? Rick Doblin did. And then he did it. Now, here's a quick heads up. This episode is in 2 parts. The first conversation was recorded a few months ago and beautifully captures Rick's 40-year journey, including never-before-told stories about his early life, the founding of MAPS, and what it's like to stay true to a vision no one else believed was possible. If you have followed this movement, you will find it rich and insightful. Now, if you're newer and looking for takeaways, stick with it because the second half really has a lot to offer. But before releasing the episode, the FDA made its decision not to approve MDA-assisted psychotherapy on first review. In light of that, and with Psychedelic Science 2025, the second largest psychedelic conference in the history of the world, around the corner here in Denver, and several major internal transitions happening at MAPS and Lycos, formerly MAPS PBC, I decided we had to sit down with Rick for a second conversation. You will notice an audio quality shift in the second part, but I promise you it is worth it because Rick spills the proverbial tea. We get into the inner workings and machinations of MAPS and Lycos, fundraising challenges, philanthropic shifts, and adventures out at Burning Man, the future of psychedelic medicine policy and public perception, and his own personal approaches for staying committed through this uncertainty, including how he got back on the horse, or as Rick puts it, and as it will be memorialized on stage at PS25, riding on the wings of the phoenix towards the larger calling. In this episode, we discuss how to build systems and practices to sustain yourself over time, how to get Jared Polis, Rick Perry, and Christian Cinema, as well as ex-Israeli and Palestinian combatants, on the same stage together voluntarily. How to remain warm, open, and connected in the face of mass public criticism. What it takes to scale a movement from a single believer to a global institution. Structuring your organization, for-profit, nonprofit, or something else. How to turn enemies to allies. How to fight major institutions and win. Making bipartisan coalitions last, smokable tasks, yes, you heard that right, and other unconventional approaches to management, how to discern grit from stubbornness, and how to reframe fundraising asks to truly connect with lasting mission-aligned support. We also touch on MAPS' new push to measure gross national trauma with a goal of net zero trauma by 2070 and how you, as a public servant, leader, or active citizen, can help us get there. If you want to go deep inside the psychedelic movement to understand what's going on and learn from the man in doing the impossible who shares his toolkit so that you are resourced to do so as well in your way, then you will love this deep, historic, and radically honest conversation with the man, the myth, the legend, Rick Doblin. Let's go.
Okay, so Benny Shannon was the head of cognitive psychology at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And as you might expect, the head of cognitive psychology was very cognitive. He wasn't so, he wasn't a therapist or anything, but he got really interested in ayahuasca, and ayahuasca helped open him up emotionally, and it was very inspirational for him. So he wrote a book about ayahuasca that sort of characterized the range of experiences that people have under the influence of ayahuasca. But then later he started looking at the roots of Judaism, and he wrote this paper about how he believes that Moses was high on the manna. The manna was psychedelic. And so when Moses saw the burning bush, that was actually a psychedelic experience. And so this kind of was a remarkable claim to try to make. And it got a lot of media attention. So it was reported on in the New York Times, this paper that he'd written about how Moses was high when he saw the burning bush. So I went to my dad, and this is 10, 15 years ago. I said, my dad, look, my whole life is justified. I'm interested in psychedelics, but it starts from Moses. You might have thought that, this wasn't quite your plan for your firstborn child. But look, it's all in line with Judaism. And, I'm just following in the footsteps of Moses. My dad was sort of taken aback a little bit. And then he said, in order to believe in that, first off, I'd have to believe in Moses.
It's the most Jewish answer I've ever heard.
Right. And then he went on to say there's no archaeological evidence that the Jews built the pyramids. There's no archaeological evidence that for 40 years, this massive number of Jews wandered through the Sinai Desert. So I was just taken aback. There was very little I could say to my dad at that point. But it was really impressive logic.
That's so funny. I mean, first, I love that the acclamation or affirmation that you thought you needed to attain Dad's approval of this path that is saving millions of lives is the most famous Jewish person to ever live. And then Dad's like, right. Well, I don't know, all these other things.
Yeah, no, he was great about that. He was very logical. In a kind of good way, just apropos of what's going on right now with Israel and Gaza. He really felt that there was this incredible opportunity that Israel had to really build a country that had no discrimination against anybody, including the Israeli Arabs. But that's not actually what happened. And so he sort of looked at Israel as a lost opportunity in some ways. And we can see now, I think, how the fundamentalists on all the different sides of the religions, the Christian fundamentalists, the Messianic ones, the Islamic fundamentalists, Jewish fundamentalists, God gave us this land and health, everybody else, that it's really this problem of fundamentalism, regardless of which religion. That's sort of one of the transformations that when we talk about global consciousness and the shift that seems to be necessary in order for us not to destroy each other will be this move from sort of literalism and fundamentalism to more symbolism, metaphorical, mystical, where the mystics of the different religions will realize that they have more in common with the people who are mystics of other religions than they do with the fundamentalists of their own religion. That's why I really appreciate my father's opening statement about how he didn't really believe in Moses, that it doesn't really matter if there was a historical person like that. It's a story, it's a mythology, and it's inspiring in different ways. And I think when you make it into literal, like, the Dome of the Rock is where Muhammad flew up to heaven on his horse Mubarak, or Jesus was virgin birth, or that Rabbi Schneerson from the Lubavitcher was the Messiah, even though he's been dead for a while. Yeah, so I think it's just the big challenge I see from humanity in general, and in terms of healing our politics also, it's to move from us and them, and that the polarization that we have, and to move from literalism to metaphorical, and to really get back to understanding what we share is more important than how we differ.
In so many ways, what you were describing in the Middle East is a lot of humans with very clear, good intentions falling off of their path. And that's my observation and judgment, and who's to say that mine is correct or anyone else's. But I think we can safely say that what's happening right now is not good for any of the humans involved.
Yeah.
And in providing a pathway for leaders of equal conviction and equal desire to serve, to find the path you're talking about, which is a path of, yes, conviction, and yes, vision, impossible vision, some would say, but openness and caring and curiosity along the way. I really, truly can't think of a better exemplar that I've had the good fortune to meet in my life than you. There's a quote that's often attributed to Gandhi. Sometimes that's questioned on the internet, but often attributed to Gandhi. That is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. I can't hear that without thinking about your story.
Wow.
20 years of being ignored, 10 years of being laughed at, 5 years of being fought. That's probably not entirely over. Recently, Time Magazine, 100 global health influencers
Does that resonate with you, that journey?
It does, although I would add one other step. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they take you for granted, and then you win. Like right now, people in America don't really understand how relatively short it was ago that women got the vote.
Yeah.
But it's sort of taken for granted. Like, oh yeah, women can vote. But that's 100 years. It's not really from the beginnings of America. So I think there's this way where once you've started to succeed and then it starts to become part of the mainstream culture, then people just assume it's always been like that. And no, it's not that special. And then you're sort of taken for granted. And that's when okay, now you're embedded. Now, of course, there can always be backlashes, like what we're seeing now with a lot of women's rights and even democracy is, and gerrymandering, and so much is being rolled back. So I think that once you're taken for granted and once you, quote, win, you have to keep renewing that all the time. And I'll just refer to one of the most important books I've ever read, which was by Hermann Hesse. And some people may know him from Journey to the East or Siddhartha, but Magister Ludi, the glass bead game, was the book that he wrote during World War II. And it was something that really helped him win the Nobel Prize. And the book was about this post-apocalyptic culture after the wars, after the nuclear wars. And what had happened is that people had learned how to channel sort of this innate competitiveness, aggressiveness, instead of trying to kill others or to take their territory or enslave them or, take their resources. They saw the devastating aspect of that kind of warfare and this post-apocalyptic setting. And so they had transformed this competitiveness into what they called the glass bead game. And what it was this attempt to make the most sort of beautiful, descriptive statement about the human condition. But it was through music and mathematics and poetry. And it would be this kind of statement that you would make describing the beautiful world. And that was then the competitions that were held around the world into this glass bead game. But what happens is that over time, this glass bead game becomes too esoteric, too removed from people's passions, and it no longer serves the purpose of channeling aggression and competitiveness in these positive ways. And so the book has the leader of the glass bead game, Magister Ludi, leaving this community in order to sort of find a new way. So I think that this idea of, once you're taking for granted, then you win, that, growing up, I never really believed this idea that every generation has to fight for freedom. I thought, okay, we've got the American system, we've got the Constitution, we've got the Bill of Rights. It's sort of been won. And, I know there's been wars constantly, and the World War II and World War I were both ways to try to, protect democracy and keep authoritarianism from taking over the world. But now it's pretty clear how perilously close we are.
So it seems to be sort of baked into the human condition in some way. You see this pop up in so many different areas. For instance, we have a story that entrenched wealth is always there, but the truth is most families lose wealth in 3 generations. By the 3rd generation, people stop doing the things that are required to protect it, keep it, grow it, etc. And I think the same could be said for democratic systems or any system. Like we atrophy the known need to do the things required to maintain the systems that provide the benefits that we want.
I think so. And I think one of the, get back to my parents in a way, is just that they always valued public education. They could have sent us to private schools if they wanted to. They actually moved into an area that had exceptional public schools. But I think that when we have this growing income inequality, and then we have tax breaks that sort of reward the rich, and then we defund public education or don't fund it enough as we should, there was a tipping point for a while ago where California spent more money on the criminal justice system than it did on its public education system.
Yeah.
So the drug war itself has been this incredible devastation of hope and misallocation of resources. But I now do come to this view that every generation really does have to reestablish the principles of freedom, that we can't take it as a given. We all do know about the Civil War. I mean, just the amount of devastation and death in the Civil War is, compared to the population size at the time, is just enormous. And, it does feel like people's positions are hardening so much in America. I think we're at a perilous stage, and we have let democracy atrophy. But also, when I talk about the public schools, reason, people are willing to be connected emotionally rather than pay any attention to intellectually what's said, so that stuff can be said that's nonsense. There was something I heard recently about how the CIA had gotten together a bunch of people, academics and others, to look at when is there civil war? How do you predict countries that are going to go to do that? And they're not supposed to look at the U.S., but some of the academics that worked with them did sort of do this analysis on the U.S. And they found, two different big predictors. One of them is when you have a majority that's losing its majority.
That's right.
And so we have like the white Christian Americans who are living in a society that is becoming increasingly diverse. And we will, I don't know what the exact years are, 10, 15 years or whatever, something like that, become majority minority people. Yeah. So you've got this group that's been in power, but sees demographically or for whatever other reason that their power is on the wane. Then the other thing that really contributes to this idea of civil war is that people no longer affiliate themselves on the basis of policies, but they affiliate themselves on the basis of tribes.
Identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's identity.
And so I think we've got that right now. And within that, when you think about Hitler and you think about all the things that he said that don't make logical sense, and the more preposterous that they are, the more you think, how can anybody believe this? But it turns out, I think I've come to understand, and others have pointed this out, that the very preposterous nature of the lie is what makes it successful. That because if you say that you believe it, that you're sort of throwing your lot in with this group, because you're saying, I'm moving past logic. I'm just, this is the group I'm in, and I'm going to believe that. And it's sort of a big commitment to sort of throw away rationality. So,
and then you've got to defend that choice.
Yeah. Yes. And then you do continue to defend it. Then the other part that's so difficult, and I think this is really our challenge, is as people start to see that the policies are not working, how do you get them to change their mind? A lot of times they don't. And so one question is, how many Germans were still pro-Hitler at the end of World War II?
Sure.
After they had seen the whole country destroyed, enormous numbers of people killed, everything devastated. But even that wasn't enough to turn enough people against Hitler. He had to be beaten from the outside, not from the inside.
Well, I would argue that one of the ways we do that is by demonstrating efficacy, by doing things that seemed impossible, by providing outcomes and results that they didn't think were within the realm of possibility. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that you and the organizations that you've run have done. And so what I'd really love to do now is drop into the specific experience.
Okay.
Keep in mind, before the intro to this show, many of the people listening probably had not heard your name, might not even be aware of what's going on. I would argue, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but within that psychedelic bubble, some of that taken for granted is real. They probably don't know that in Colorado that there is a move to, we already have personal use and regulated uses coming. Like most of this is probably brand new. And I mean, just to say how I see it in your work.
Yeah.
You started something before I was born. that at the time was seemingly impossible. And I want to kind of get your take on the environment at the time, but it literally probably seemed impossible.
Yeah.
You've dedicated an entire lifespan to this. You've cultivated a movement that is truly post-partisan at a time of rampant partisanship. And despite all the slings and arrows, you have, as far as I can tell, maintained this like joyful sense of childlike glee in your work, and you are so kind to people. So I really want to start at the beginning, and just first, for people who don't know what you're doing, what is the vision? What is the mission that's driven you, and where did that download come from?
First off, what really began this whole adventure, to start with, one of the things about Judaism that's so well done in a way is the holidays and the history. And you really get this whole historical sweep over thousands of years of where your tribe has come from and what it's been through. And so the story I was told, I was born in 1953, right after the Holocaust, right after the end of World War II, as the first of 4 children. My grandfather came over to the U.S. from Poland, my dad's father, in 1920, fleeing anti-Semitism after World War I, but before World War II. Relatives left behind were killed by the Nazis. My great-grandparents on my mother's side came over from Russia in around 1880 to Chicago, also fleeing anti-Semitism. And so the story I was told was that I was this link in the chain, and that there were poor refugees coming to America, and then the American dream. Then they were able to work and to succeed and to build businesses, to become well off, to become safe. And then I was the sort of lucky one in this historical chain that was able to arrive at a time where my parents were saying to me as I was growing up that we want to find out what you want to do and help you do that. My dad was an only child, lived in the Bronx. His parents, my grandparents, had a small bookstore. They lived above the bookstore. My dad learned how to read a book without breaking the spine so they could sell it after he'd done reading it. And he was told basically from the age of 4 or 5 that he had to be a doctor. That was kind of the way out of poverty. And so he was this only child Jewish doctor, and he was really glad to be a doctor, liked being a doctor. But he said that his goal was to raise us to help us do what we wanted to do.
Yeah.
So there's that background. So MAPS just had its 38th year anniversary. And our 38th anniversary happened to be on April 8th. That's when I started MAPS in 1986. And that happened to be the full solar eclipse through much of the United States. And so the universe was celebrating our birthday. And so we decided to have a big gathering and a celebration at the Texas Eclipse Festival. And we had big speaker series with all sorts of psychedelic luminaries, and in the midst of this much, much larger gathering. So the metaphor that I want to give that's been sticking with me about my origin story is that when you think about the eclipse, what's happening at totality, you've got the moon that's slowly blocking off the sun. Andrew Weil was one of the speakers at the Eclipse Festival, and he said that it's very unusual that the sun is roughly 400 times larger than the moon, and the moon is roughly 400 times closer to the Earth than the sun. And so you can have this kind of almost perfect blotting out of the sun, except it's so perfect that what you see is this just darkness with this little rim of fire of light and illumination around the perimeter. So it's so mild in a way that at totality, you can stare at the sun without any problem. You've got this brilliant, warm, healthy glow of energy, of life-giving energy, but everything in the center is darkness, is blotted out. So when I think about myself, I think about the core of me is filled with fear and anxiety. about the world, about people. Jung said that we need to understand more about humanity, more about psychology, because we have no real predators anymore. We are the only thing we really have to worry about. And then he said, we are the source of all coming evil. So I feel this darkness that I learned about the Holocaust growing up. I was a young boy during the Cuban Missile Crisis when we could blow up the whole, world with nuclear weapons. And then it sort of metamorphosized into my own country doing the Vietnam War. So I have this sense of this core of darkness, but wrapped in privilege. So I was born at a time of maximum American exceptionalism. After we sort of were the unquestioned world power, then in the 60s, of course, we're now going to the moon. So I had this, I just absorbed American exceptionalism. Somehow or other, we're better than other people because we're Americans. It's not, I don't think that anymore, of course. I think it was really about our political system where we weren't killing each other in all the different states. Like in Europe, all the countries have been at odds with each other, but this was the United States. So we had power from sharing more than we do now. It's more, as you said, very hyper-partisan now. So this idea for me is that this privilege of being American exceptionalism, also I was the chosen people. So I'm Jewish, also a male. Also, I'm the firstborn child. And also I'm white. And my family was well off. So I had every kind of privilege that you could have. And then the story that I was told was, we want to help you do whatever you think is the most important. And I could see that my survival physically was nothing to be taken for granted, that there could be a war with Russia, or that my country could send me to war somewhere, or there could be the rise of Nazism, similar or something like that elsewhere. So I just was in this kind of unique and wonderful spot. So what happened in 1972, 52 years ago, when I was 18 years old, is that I was at college. Again, speaking about politics, people may have heard about New College of Florida. It's the honors college of the state of Florida. It was a private school when I went to it. Then it had financial problems, and it ended up merging with the state of Florida. But I went to the school when it was a private school. It had started around, the first class was 65, and I went there in 71. And it was just like an oasis of sanity in a crazy world. And I ended up starting to experiment with psychedelics. And I found them to be what I had hoped my bar mitzvah would have been.
I've heard you talk about this terrible bar mitzvah. What can you just give us a thumbnail of that?
Well, it wasn't terrible at all. It was just like a normal party. And what was terrible was that I had these expectations that it would transform me. That I would be a man, that there would be some spiritual inner energies that would be catalyzed.
I read a Haftorah, my chest just grows hair right there, standing there. That's how that works, right?
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought I had this idea, of course, that God is a man, and I thought that I'd be visited by God, that there would be some kind of like affirmation. Yeah, you're on the right track. And so I remember being in bed the morning after my bar mitzvah. We had a party, and I did okay. But I'm like, I'm the same person that I was yesterday morning, and nothing's changed. And I thought, okay, this takes time. Maybe it's like lots and lots of people got bar and bat mitzvahed, and God maybe needs a bunch of time, and there's a list, and he'll get to me. So the second morning, I wake up, and I'm like, well, I think I'm still the same. Nothing's happened. And I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, a week goes by, and a whole bunch of new people got bar and bat mitzvahed. And I realized that I had dropped off the list, that it wasn't going to happen. It was just this kind of outer ceremony that I think probably did really work for a lot of people for thousands of years.
Yeah.
But in our modern culture, somehow it didn't catch me where I live. But when I first started doing LSD, I thought, aha, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Because who am I? Where do I fit in? What is the larger universe? What is this death thing? What is life and death? What is this beyond ego states? What does it mean to have courage to let go, which was very, very difficult for me, being not very emotionally adept or aware. So what psychedelics did for me when I first started taking them was that they really opened me up to my emotions. Well, it wasn't that I had these revelations where this time God came and talked to me. That didn't happen. But I did have this sense of being connected to something much larger, deeply spiritual, transcended time and space, something that was a part of me that I wasn't completely separate from it. And it inspired me. And then I was paying attention to what some of the astronauts had been saying who had gone to the moon. And quite a number of them talked about how seeing the Earth from space as sort of a single living entity. You don't see the borders, you don't see the languages, you don't see the religions, you just see this ecosystem that has sported incredible variety of life, all different kinds. Edgar Mitchell, one of the astronauts, talked about it as when you see this unity from space, it changes everything about how you think, and it changes your politics. And so I thought that psychedelics offered a way to address this darkness at the heart of darkness in humanity, our willingness to sacrifice others for our own needs, and to think that's the way it has to be. And so this potential of how do we get out of the situation that we're in? I just heard about a quote from the scientist E.O. Wilson, was a Harvard professor, did a lot of work on ants. And what he said was that the problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies.
Yeah.
Albert Einstein had said the splitting of the atom has changed everything except our mode of thinking. And hence we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. And what shall be required if mankind is to survive is a whole new mode of thinking.
Yeah. And we just had a guest on who said something similar to the first quote, a little bit different, but it was about the mismatch between our political systems and expectations. So 18th century systems, 19th century politics, 20th century technology, 21st century expectations, and the mismatch between what those systems can deliver and the expectation is what is undergirding all of this distrust and disconnection from the institutions you talked about earlier. And those two things together is a very perilous moment.
Yeah, I think that was a really apt description, very, very similar. And so when I was 18 years old and I was thinking also, for those people that really appreciate politics, I grew up in Chicago. And when I was 11 years old, and I mean, this may sound ridiculous, but what happened was, this is now 1964. This is the election with Barry Goldwater and Johnson. There was this phone number that you could call and you would hear a recorded message, and it would change every week. And I was like, wow, this is like a secret, mysterious thing. You can this was at the day where, for those people that remember being young, and watching The Wizard of Oz, that we had to wait an entire year to see The Wizard of Oz again. There was no VCR. There was no way. So once something's broadcast on TV, that's the only way you could see it. It had been taken out of the movie theaters, and
interesting.
You could see it once a year is when they would show it again. So it was super exciting. So for me as this almost 11-year-old to have this number that you could call on the phone and you get this message and then it changes every week. It turned out it was from the John Birch Society, which is this super right-wing group who see communists under every bed. But I didn't know that. And I just thought, wow, this is really interesting. And they talked about how Johnson had migrant laborers on his ranch, Lyndon Johnson, and he was a bad, bad person and stuff. So I thought, okay, I must be for Goldwater. But in 1968, I had transformed so much. And now this is where I'm almost 15 years old. And I was precinct captain for Eugene McCarthy, the peace candidate of 1968. And, I was doing it in this affluent area called Winnetka, north of Chicago.
It's where my mom went to high school.
Oh, yeah, me too. Neutral East.
Yeah.
Did she? Wow.
I don't know if she was East or West or if it was a period. She was born in 57, if that helps. And my dad went to Evanston. So we're in the neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, that was when it was East and West. And depending on where you lived in Winnetka, you could go to one or the other. And it was just this area that was mostly Republican. And so nobody really voted for Eugene McCarthy. So I decided that I wanted to be connected politically to all these struggles. But the only way I could get into the convention was to volunteer to be a runner between the delegates for Mayor Daley, who is the mayor of Chicago. So I was wearing
Daley was coming up somewhere.
Yeah. So I was wearing this little red, white, and blue uniform and got into the convention center and was supposed to be helping the delegates. And one of the strong memories I have is down sort of in the convention center, but on the periphery, not on the floor, where you're walking around, there was a media room. And the media room had all these TVs. And from there, I could see the riots that were happening, the police riots against the demonstrators that are worse than anything that's happening right now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And what just shocked me was the people at the convention acting as if nothing abnormal was happening, trying to carry on business as usual, while these incredible violent riots were happening in downtown Chicago, a bit away from the convention center.
Really, as a kid, how are you feeling about that in the moment?
Well, I'm feeling like there is just such massive hypocrisy and unwillingness to really have enough people think from a compassionate place. Like, is this really about stopping communism in Vietnam, or is this a civil war that we're getting involved in? And, it really was more indigenous freedom fighters. So I just thought that this was a very dysfunctional political system, but it made me then keep thinking about how to respond to when your own country is doing things that you think it shouldn't do. And that's where I really started reading Gandhi and Thoreau, Emerson, Martin Luther King, Tolstoy on nonviolent resistance and what that is.
Yeah.
And I had seen that be pretty effective in the civil rights movement in the 60s. So I decided that I would practice nonviolent resistance in my opposition to Vietnam. And I would do that by not registering for the draft. So people don't often realize how you get sucked into systems. Back when there was a draft, young men had to send in a postcard to register, to get on the list. And at the time, I had a passport, I had a driver's license, I had a social security number, I was paying taxes, I was in school, high school. I just figured that I was on a million different lists. And what would happen is when I didn't send in this postcard, that the people would notice and they'd come and arrest me and I would go to jail and I would cost the system money. And that would be my way to register my protest. And my dad and mother were sympathetic, and they said, we're not so thrilled by what you're thinking of doing, but we're not opposed to it. But just realize that you're never going to be able to be a doctor or a lawyer or any kind of thing that needs a license because you will have been a felon by being a draft resistor. And I said, okay, that's the price I have to pay. So then when I'm starting to do psychedelics and I'm starting to have difficult experiences, but intimations of something deeper, I go to the guidance counselor at New College, and it was still a private school. It had a tradition of all-night dance parties with psychedelics in a beautiful courtyard designed by I.M. Pei, the architect. And then it also had this Olympic-sized swimming pool donated to the college by this husband of a professor. This is a professor that actually had studied with Jung. And so, the swimming pool became a nudist colony. And I was like this shy guy from high school, could barely talk to girls. And now I'm like surrounded by naked women and naked guys in this swimming pool. And it just felt like this school was as I said, this oasis of sanity in a crazy world, bringing things to the surface, sex and drugs that were kind of suppressed in many different ways. And when things get suppressed, they get distorted, and it's difficult to bring them up to the surface. That's sort of the essence of therapy, is you bring buried things to the surface and you have to process them. It can be difficult, but it just felt like this wonderful opportunity for me to start experimenting with psychedelics. And when I went to the guidance counselor in the middle of my first year of college and said, this is becoming more important to me than my studies, that I'm realizing that, as I said, society in general, humanity in general, is overdeveloped intellectually and underdeveloped emotionally and spiritually. I'm like that. And I thought I need really to focus more on emotions. And so the guidance counselor, as I said, took me seriously, and he gave me this manuscript copy of a book by Stan Grof, Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research. Now, Stan was an MD, PhD, born in Czech Republic. He'd left in 1968 after the Russians came in to crush the revolution in Czech Republic, and he came with suitcases, and almost they were entirely filled with his notes from his LSD research that he had done in Prague, starting in the middle 50s. And so here he was, MD, PhD at Johns Hopkins, where his research is just being shut down, and he's getting ready to leave and go out to be a scholar in residence at Esalen. That would happen for the next 15 years or so. And so I asked my guidance counselor, who had this manuscript copy years before the book was even published. He had it directly from Stan. So I asked him if he could send a letter to Stan from me, and he said, sure. So I asked Stan for advice on how do I become a psychedelic therapist, since I thought that I'm going to be a criminal, I'm going to be, underground psychedelic therapist. And so my earliest identification was I am a counterculture drug-using criminal. And so the arc of my life has been from counterculture to culture, from criminal to legal, and sustain the drug using throughout the lifespan.
What's fascinating about that is you did not ride that wave. You manufactured that wave with so many people.
Yeah.
So when do you go from this is what I'm going to do, this impossible idea, to like, I'm actually going to do something about it? And how do you get anyone else, and maybe even describe for folks who weren't around at that time, what the environment was like, how wildly absurd this was?
To give you a sense of what it was, there was all these stories about how LSD would cause chromosome damage, that if you took LSD 6 times or more, you were certifiably insane. You will have undone your ability to reason properly. You will be crazy. You will stare at the sun and go blind. You will jump out of windows and die. And at the time, in American culture, and this I think may help people understand how psychedelics became so controversial, but the way people dealt with death was to not speak about it. If you had cancer, you didn't really talk about it. The first hospice where people can have more of a, humane supportive death, where you're not just doing everything to keep them alive with all the machines. The first hospice wasn't in America till 1974. So in the 60s, death was kind of off the table. You didn't really talk about it. Birth, women were tranquilized. Men were not allowed in the delivery room. And also, one of the things that I remember vividly is when the Beatles came to America and they brought these crazy guy in robe to teach meditation. This was transcendental meditation, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And he was super strange. And when you talked about yoga, people thought that that was new and would make you into a Hindu or a Buddhist or whatever. That yoga was dangerous, that meditation and mindfulness were not accepted at all. Again, death and birth were sort of suppressed. So it was a difficult cultural context for psychedelics to emerge in. And they emerged at a time when, there was a lot of underground research or quiet research done by the CIA and the military for mind control and brainwashing. And Ken Kesey, who actually wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is the book that really broke the spell for me about what I'd learned about psychedelics in school, because I loved the book so much. And a friend of mine gave it to me. And then after I gave it back to him, he said, this person wrote some of this under the influence of LSD. And it turned out it was true. And that really changed my mind. But then the psychedelics became this idea of going beyond our individual self, that identity. It inspired a whole bunch of young people to think, why are we killing people in Vietnam? We're similar to them. And then this helped with the rise of the environmental movement and the women's rights movement, and even with the civil rights movement. And so psychedelics really got tangled up in the counterculture. And in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed. Nixon managed to do that. And John Ehrlichman, who was the domestic policy advisor for Nixon, in the late 70s, he did an interview, and he said that the two main enemies of the Nixon White House were the civil rights movement and the hippies.
Yeah.
And he said he couldn't stop them from protesting, but what he could do is criminalize the drugs they were using. And he could use the drug war to try to arrest people, to try to bust up their meetings, to try to put the leaders in jail. And then John Ehrlichman said to Dan Bohm, the reporter, he said, did we know we were exaggerating the risks of our drugs? He said, yes, of course we did. Now, keep in mind also that this was the height of American power, and America, in a tragically successful exported the drug war all over the world through international treaty obligations. And so when research with psychedelics was stopped in the United States was so powerful that we were able to stop it all over the world. It was just this incredible overreaction to the counterculture. And I think what we were able to see as I was watching this was that this overreaction, Timothy Leary being the most dangerous man in America, according to President Nixon, it made me start to think, what is Timothy Leary doing right? I started wondering, what is Timothy Leary doing right that Nixon is so pissed off at him? Why is there this overreaction? And so once I started doing LSD and went to the guidance counselor and then read Stan Groff's book of the promise of psychedelic research and what it'll help us understand about spirituality, about religion, about different states of consciousness, about what kind of consciousness would you need to be if there was a Moses, seeing the burning bush. People often on psychedelics can sort of see trees as living entities in ways that we don't normally notice them in all their glorious life. When I woke up to LSD after the backlash, and the time was just so negative, and the global ban, it just made me think that humanity was at great peril, that psychedelics, and not psychedelics, but the consciousness that they can bring, which can happen in other ways. One of the beautiful things about Stan Groff is that after LSD was criminalized, he developed a way through hyperventilation that he calls holotropic breath work to generate psychedelic experiences. Sure. It just comes from breathing. These are experiences that are not in the drug. They're in us. And that's what the holotropic breath work demonstrates. And so Stan kept this thread alive. But it made me think that there was really something essential about understanding our commonality, about understanding what the astronauts were saying, and that understanding is not enough. You need experience. You need to feel it. And I'm reminded of Rita Marley, who was Bob Marley's wife. And she had an album that she put out that was really good. And it's called Who Feels It Knows It. So that we needed to move to an experiential understanding of our role in the cosmos. And I felt like there was a shift that took place with Copernicus and Galileo, where up to that time, people thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And through science, it became clear that the Earth was not the center of the universe, not even close to it. And so there was this shift in human consciousness about where our place was in the cosmos. Now I think there's needing to be a similar shift. And you could say the fact that we can talk right now is going to be through incredible internet and through incredible, brilliant technology, that there is a way in which the invisible space between me and my computer, or, between you and your microphone, is the entire knowledge base of humanity. That if you have the right receiver, you can download from this thin air space everything that's on the internet.
Mm.
And you can tap into AI, and you can tap, and it's just, we can't not see it with our normal senses, but it's in the air, this kind of these waveforms that contain all this incredible, it's just miraculous. And I don't think we take too much of it for granted, the miraculous nature of just being alive. So
Absolutely.
it felt to me that even though this idea of working to bring back psychedelics might never work, and I saw like the idealism of the 60s have crashed and burned, and everything's criminalized and everything's wiped out. And I thought, okay, I have the luxury from my family to not worry if I'm going to starve or be able to pay rent.
Yeah.
I will have sort of core survival taken care of for my family as part of this multi-generational, odyssey from refugees to the American dream. And I felt like in this heart of darkness that's my core, it's not overwhelming because of this wrapper of privilege that gave me the sense I could do something about it. That I thought there's so many people are going to be working on solar energy and renewable energy and organic foods and all of this. But I thought, okay, I have this luxury. I will devote myself to this idea that we need to bring back this kind of consciousness, and psychedelics are able to do that.
Can I just ask a question in there, which is, have you wanted to quit? How many times have you wanted to quit, if so? And what do you do to bring yourself back?
I've never really wanted to quit. And that's because, again, this heart of darkness is, if I quit, I could end up in the concentration camp or other people camp, or the world could blow up. I mean, so that's why I said I'm propelled by this fear of not focusing on what I think is the most important thing, which is this unitive state of consciousness. If we can all feel connected, then all sorts of things. Then with our brilliance of technology, we can solve all the problems that we have. And if we can equitably distribute resources. So there was one time that was, I didn't want to quit, but I was so frustrated. And this gets back to Galileo and Copernicus and the kind of consciousness shift. So this was in the early 2000s. So, MDMA was criminalized in 1985. It was a therapy drug from the middle 70s to early 80s. It kind of escaped from that and became used as ecstasy, as a party drug. That's what attracted the attention of the government. So in 85, the DEA, moves to criminalize. And in 86, I started MAPS. It took 6 years before any of our protocols were accepted by the FDA. They were all rejected. But what happened then was that this new group at the FDA, the pilot drug evaluation staff, took over the role of supervising research with psychedelics from the group that had blocked it for 20 years.
Just a generational shift, retirement, or why does this happen?
Actually, it was how different social justice movements can help each other. The group ACT UP, that was part of the gay rights movement, was very upset in the 80s when people were dying right and left from AIDS, but that the FDA was very slow to support research into treatment for AIDS. And they were overly conservative. They would knock out things if it had any risk, even if the risk-benefit profile could be very favorable. So a group of people from ACT UP surrounded the FDA building and shut it down. And they said, you need to find new ways to develop drugs faster. People are dying. We need you to shift this little emphasis on how risk-averse you are. So out of this protest by ACT UP and others came this internal effort inside the FDA to speed up how they review drugs. And they created the pilot drug evaluation staff. So then, in 1987, I graduated from college. I was looking forward to getting a clinical psych PhD. And I wasn't able to do that. Nobody would let me in because MDMA had just been criminalized. And so that's where I realized that I had to study the politics. The science was being blocked by the politics. That's where I shifted to go to Harvard and got my master's and PhD from the Kennedy School of Government. And that's where I started learning about how to work through the system. And I actually had this opportunity to apply for presidential management internship, now called Presidential Management Fellowship. It's for people that want careers in the federal government. And so this is part of the arc of becoming counterculture to culture. And so I thought, okay, I'm here at the Kennedy School. I'll see how legit people might think I am. So I applied for this, I got it, and then I applied for a job at the FDA. It's like 150 people a year, and you're in this group cohort, and they take you out for management training lessons. And then at the end, people throughout the whole government agencies. I almost got this job at the FDA. It was really great. I was super excited. It took like 6 months of vetting. I went to the head of Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the person in charge of all drug research in the FDA, had to vet me. And at the last minute, the DEA said that they would refuse to work with me because I had previously sued them, trying to keep MDMA legal, and had won the lawsuit, and forced them to ignore the judge's recommendation. And then we sued them twice in the appeals court and won twice. Eventually, we lost the third time. But I couldn't get the job at the FDA. In any case, I learned about the system. All right, so now through the 90s, we get permission to do our phase 1 safety study. And then in the 2000, we're starting to try to do research with MDMA for PTSD. So this is now, 14 years after MAPS has been started. This is now our first effort to try to show something about the therapeutic use of MDMA. And the FDA said, yes, you can do this study. We will give you permission for studying MDMA for PTSD. We were delighted. And then you need an ethics committee approval also, called institutional review boards. And so we were not connected to an institution. No institution would work with us. This was with Michael Mithoefer, our lead psychiatrist. Just to give you a sense of the frustration, he was in Charleston, South Carolina. He had a lecture position at the Medical University of South Carolina. And he didn't teach classes, but he could refer patients there, and occasionally he could be guest lecturers or things like that. And a friend of his who was a professor there, who had done the phase 3 studies on Zoloft for PTSD and SSRI, she was going to work with us. So that was great. And but near the end of the process of working on the protocol and getting FDA permission, she said that she wanted to get a job in the drug czar's office, the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. And they told her that if she would get this job, that she couldn't even apply. They would not even accept her application if she was affiliated with a project working on MDMA. So she had to quit. And then when we finally did get permission from the FDA, and we thought now we're going to go to the medical university, they told Michael Mithoefer, we're not going to let you do this. You don't have any senior faculty supporting you anymore. And so they said, no, Michael, you're either going to have to leave the affiliation with us, with the medical university, and give up your connection to this drug research if you want to stay affiliated with us. And he refused. So we had to go with what are called independent institutional review boards. And the world's biggest one, American, also was the Western IRB. And they approved it. So we're like, oh, great. This is great. Now we're getting ready to start MDMA research. This is after now 17 years.
Yeah, can I just hit pause for a second? Like mid-course pause on this, because I want to draw attention to the fact that you're 17 years into this. You're not even studying yet. You're 22 years from today. I mean, this is a long journey. And there will be people listening who want to do seemingly impossible things that are going to give up in 3 months. Like some of us give up on a pizza order because there's an extra button these days. Okay. And so we had Jerry Colonna on the show recently, amazing coach, human, heart-centered leader. And he talks about the difference between grit and stubbornness and how grit is a good thing, but stubbornness is actually problematic in leadership. And I wonder how you self-evaluated or determined that your actions were gritty. You had to keep going. This was valiant. And you weren't just doing something out of stubbornness. Did you ever think about that?
Yes, I did. And so what I would say is that, first off, my own psychedelic experiences kept renewing my sense that these are incredible tools. They're not inherently good or bad in themselves. They're how they're used. And I think we've lost that. And then I would be hearing all these stories of healing from different people. So from 88 to 90, I actually was trained by Stan Groff and Christina, his wife, in holotropic breath work. So we get together, a group of us, around 30 people. We would get together for 2 weeks, every 6 months for 3 years. And this was the training to be a holotropic breathwork. And that was from 88 to 90. So that was the same time I was getting my master's at the Kennedy School. I was also doing this inner work. And so I would be having my conviction renewed about the value of non-ordinary states of consciousness on a continual basis, from my own experiences, from experiences of my friends, from my reading. even in these dark days when psychedelic research was all blocked.
That makes sense.
So it didn't seem stubborn. It felt like a grit, but motivated by this fear that if I give up, the irrational can take over.
Yes.
Which is sort of in the midst of where we are now. So
that's the strategy for refilling your cup and spending time with remarkable humans in the community. I get that.
Yeah.
Been grateful enough to have my cup filled in that way from time to time as well. But for those working with you, these people you're bringing along on this impossible journey, are they participating, or are there other means that you are utilizing to keep their belief strong, to keep them involved? How are you bringing other people along?
First off, the people that I was bringing along almost uniformly, they were people that had their own psychedelic experiences, knew from their own experience that there's something incredibly potentially beneficial and healing about what psychedelics do to our mind and our bodies and our emotions. The other part of it is, and this was a critical thing for me, and this is where I tried to teach people that I worked with, is that you cannot base your happiness on whether you succeed in what you're doing. Success cannot be the goal. I mean, it is the goal, but it cannot be the measuring stick by which you evaluate you're happy or you've succeeded. It has to be about effort. If you try hard and at the end of the day you've done nothing, you can still be happy for trying hard.
Yeah.
And I think that was this big shift, was orienting myself around effort and sharing that with other people.
How'd you identify that? And then how do you maintain that in practice? How do you remind yourself of or stay grounded in it?
You could say I had an easy lesson, because when I started, it seemed impossible.
Low expectations are the secret to success.
Right. It just seemed like I might never succeed. I mean, this is kind of a grim analogy, but I thought growing up, Jewish people are taught about the Warsaw Ghetto and the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto against the Nazis. Now, it was doomed from the start, right? And they were all wiped out.
Yeah.
But at least they did some damage to the Nazis. So the sense that you could die an honorable death even if the thing that you were doing was a complete failure, deciding to stand up and fight. I had that in my mind, that this idea that if the world blows up, at least we will have tried.
Yeah.
And it's bigger than any one of us anyway. You have to work with others. And so it was very, very clear to me that it might never work. And so I would just have to be happy with the effort. The other part was to redefine success, not just to effort, but to small victories. Even like you have a conversation with somebody who says, oh, I didn't think that before. Now, this is actually relates a bit. I didn't know this at the time, but when I met my wife, this was 1989 at the Kennedy School. Her first job out of college had been to be a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., but she was a lobbyist for the Quakers. And people don't often think of the Quakers having lobbyists.
No.
But they do. It's the Friends Committee on National Legislation.
Interesting.
And they never won anything. And so they would say, oh, we're against the military budget being this much. The way they, because they weren't evaluated on success. So the way in which they would define success is somebody in a room says, we all agree we got to give the military this much money. And they would say, well, no, we don't all agree. We think it should be less and more human needs or something like that. And then everybody would go ahead and vote for the budget the way it was. So it's just this idea of both focusing on effort, but also realizing incremental change, that is the way things happen. You can have this big, big vision of what you want to accomplish, but to recognize that you only approach it in tiny little steps. And sometimes you go backwards. Little victories is what sustains you too.
Gosh.
That it's not just the big victories. So, I remember, this is just an interesting point, is that one of the people that was from the DEA that was involved in criminalizing MDMA, this is now starting in 1984, Frank Sapienza is his name. He said that we took the DEA by surprise when we sued them, when I went to DC to sue them, because only they knew about ecstasy. the party drug. They didn't know that it had been used as a therapy drug beforehand. So for me to have a conversation with him about here's why we think it's good for therapy, even though it didn't change what he was doing, he still was part of the DEA to criminalize what we were doing. But that was like a little victory to have a conversation.
Yeah.
So I think it was that sense. And I think we all know this idea of this exponential curve, this idea that things go along and they just get slightly better little by little, but then momentum comes and then you can have this rapid shift. And so you have to realize too that these little incremental changes, you still may be getting closer to this place where things are more dramatic and change happens more quickly.
And it's just like, I just want to like highlight this so much because coming from you in particular, the two analogies, right? The entrepreneur analogy is the hockey stick moment where the growth goes hyperbolic. But the one that I think is more apt is like the musical artist that's an overnight success in 20 years. Like they've been playing to 3 people and their cats for 20 years. And all of a sudden the song goes number 1 and people think, wow, they just came out of nowhere. How lucky are they? And it's like, well, no, they've been playing to cats for 20 years. And that's what's required to do something this big. It's such a, thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay. So those are the kind of ways that I kept people inspired. You know, I'm really good at managing people that are internally motivated.
So hire well is what you're saying.
Right. Exactly. That is the key. A mentor sort of just sent me this thing today, which is hire in haste, regret at leisure. Yeah. So let me get back to this one moment to where I almost gave it. So this is now we've got FDA approval. The Western IRB approves us. We're about to start after all these years working with MDMA with PTSD. And a month later, we get this email from the Western IRB saying we withdraw our approvals. We feel that you misled us. We've learned about MDMA neurotoxicity, and this is way too dangerous of a drug, and we're not going to give you permission. We revoke your approval. And we spoke to these 3 experts, and they convinced us that you misled us. And so we were shocked. It was so frustrating. But then I realized that they had the science wrong. And so we ended up having this long process of gathering scientific opinions from multiple different experts and going after every single point that the Western IB had raised about why they were revoking permission. And in the end, after months and months of this negotiations, where we basically did rebut every single thing that they were saying, we got a letter from them saying, it's not about the science. It's about the politics. It's a member of our board of directors doesn't want us to do this. And here's your money back. Now, that never happens. You know, when you give money to an institutional review board, they review, they approve or not, but they end up keeping your money, whether they approve or not. So they sent us this money back, and it was just outrageous. And so then we had to get approval from another IRB. And the deal is that if you fail with one IRB, you have to bring that entire package of what their objections were, why you failed, to the new IRB. You can't just start with a new IRB. So we went through then multiple IRBs that refused to work with us or ended up taking time to review, and then after a couple months saying no. And this was where we went through 7 of them. And I just got so incredibly frustrated that I just have to take a break. I just can't do this anymore. And so I took a week break and I painted our house.
1 week.
1 week. And it was
and you
so
found
great.
a job.
It was so great because I'm like, okay, look, the house is better. I did something. Something in the world is actually working and I can change the world. That was just the house. And so then I got enough. And then I went back and I thought, okay, now I'm going to think back about MAPS. And then I realized, hey, MAPS is a nonprofit organization. We're an institution. We could create our own institutional review board. You know, the hell with all these other ones. And I looked at the regulations and I saw we could do it. And I sort of talked to various people and put things in motion. And then I thought, you know, there's this one thing. Now that I'm relaxed that we can do this, we'll be able to start this study. Now, this is years of trying to go through all this. Finally, I looked at the list of all these private IRBs, and there was one whose name was Copernicus.
Poetic.
And I thought, great, they know about science and being blocked by religion and politics. So I contacted them. I said, we need you to live up to your name. This is our track of 7 different IRBs. We can't get anywhere, but here's the science. And will you take a look at it? And they finally did, and they were the ones that let us start.
Wow, way to call them forward. Power in names, baby.
Yeah, it was okay. Now, then what happened after we've worked with them for 15 years or so? Now we've been working with them for over 20 years. But then they got bought by the Western IRB.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, oh, fuck. We've got this people that are really working with
2
us.
steps
It's
forward,
about the
3
science.
back. Jeez.
Okay, but enough had changed in that time that even the Western IRB had changed. So even though they bought Copernicus, what they did was, and I met the guy that wrote the letter that said, here's your money back. They invited me to give a lecture about MDMA research to all the members of their panels. So once a year or something, they'll have a big convention. They'll bring hundreds of people and they'll speak to them about what it means to review scientific literature. So they wanted me to speak about MDMA research to all the people. And then
wait, hold on. I'm gonna pause this one more time because this is clearly a phase change moment. We're moving into a new world in so many ways. So before we get to that world, for someone who is in their own policy area, in the old world, in the early phase, and you're thinking about cultivating a team that can get you through 7 rounds of rejection. You talked about hiring well.
Yeah.
What are the characteristics that you would look for to have a team who's going to stick through those 7 no's?
It was people that had done their own psychedelics, basically, and that had found them to be useful. It was also people that were idealistic. It was also people that were realizing that to work in this area is not enormously lucrative. So it had to be people that were willing to sacrifice a certain amount of income for purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I learned about philanthropy is that you always think that the people with the money are the ones with the power in a way, and that you're always asking them for what they have and what you don't have. But what I realized is it can become kind of an even exchange of meaning for money. You can have all the money in the world, but you cannot change the world by yourself. And sometimes you can get meaning by what you support. This trade of meaning for money, so I would hire people that would draw meaning from this work.
Interesting.
And that would be inspirational to them, and that would keep them going. I would also try to provide people that wanted to do things that have never been done before, but also that they have never done before, so that they would be up for that challenge. People that were somewhat emotionally open to, when we start talking about working with trauma, you're inundated with stories all the time of people that are depressed, people that are traumatized, people, help me. You get that all the time. So it had to be people that could not be overwhelmed by all the sadness and pain that was coming our way in all these different stories. And often it became younger people, that were at the earlier parts of their career, that were interested in the challenge. So for a while, it was we basically hired only people from New College who shared this vision and history.
Filter function. Yeah.
And then over time, we'd hire other people. And I think the other thing that I looked for was this ability to be comfortable being different. So, for example, during the earlier part of MAPS, I would say for maybe the first 20 years or so, and maybe even a little bit longer, people who worked at MAPS were reluctant to put it on their CV.
Sure.
Because other people would think, what did you do with psychedelics? There was a point in time where it shifted and it became an asset, not a liability. Yeah. It was a pretty unique set of circumstances, of qualities in the people that would come to work with MAPS. But it was those that saw this as connected to this bigger struggle of the survival of humanity.
Yeah.
Idealistic, independent, self-motivated people. The other part, and this is something that's, I guess, a little bit difficult to talk about, people that were comfortable being criminals.
Sure.
Because inherently, with all these drugs being illegal, not that we're leading a criminal life and taking advantage of people, but just that our tools had been criminalized.
Yeah.
And so it had to be people that were internal ethical compass, that was what's moral, not so much what's legal. And so that was also a big part of it, was people that could manage that contradiction in a way, or to live in a way where they understood that the laws were in many cases the problem, not the solution, and that in some portions of their lives, we would be living outside the law.
There's an analogous question I have in here, or maybe it's just related, and I'm not sure if this has come into focus yet, but as your work is progressing, there's also a shift in therapy in general, the approach to therapy, from sort of problems to fix to recognition and integration, like the honoring of experience rather than the shoving of experience down.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that was built into the culture in any way initially, in such a way that provided the basis and acceptance for people to make that choice.
So from the very beginning, because I was training to become a psychedelic therapist, and it was in 1984 that I worked with the first person with PTSD, who now has become one of our major trainers and major therapists working for MAPS after all these years. So we always had this therapeutic frame that the people that were working with MAPS, we'd offer them psychedelic therapy. Here's a story about the first person who ever worked at MAPS.
Yeah.
Now, I was the only person for 7 years. So this is, in a way, how we found people. So MAPS from 1986 to 1993 was just me.
Wow.
We'd work with different groups, or we'd do different contracts and stuff like that. But I was the only employee. I was living in Charlotte, and I would start to have MAPS members, and I would end up going to Kinko's a lot to get photocopies and mail it out to hundreds of people. And one night I'm at Kinko's, it's midnight, and this woman who works there hands me stuff back, and she says, I need to apologize. I read your stuff. And she said, I found it really, really interesting, and I would like to volunteer to help you. And I was like, well, that's really kind of you. What makes you motivated to help? And she said, well, I have a boyfriend who's in prison for selling LSD. My first response was, I think you must be really proud of him. And she said, why do you say that? I said, because if he's in prison, that means he didn't turn on other people, because that's the way people get out of prison when they're busted. The police want them to turn on other people. So I said, he didn't do that, and he's in prison, so you must be really proud of him. Sylvia Tyson is her name. And so she started volunteering. And then eventually I felt like that I should hire her. And then the second person, and it doesn't continue like this always, but the second person, our neighbors were kind of fundamentalist Christians, but really nice people. And the woman was a teacher. And she contacted me, and she said a friend of hers, who was also a teacher, had gotten busted for getting mushrooms in the mail. And could I help her, Eddie? So I said, sure, we can try to speak to the judge and speak to whomever about the value of mushrooms and what they are for. And so as it turned out, she got convicted, but she got probation, and she had to work for a nonprofit as part of her community service. Yeah, she went to the probation officer, and she said she wants to work for MAPS. Now, in Charlotte, North Carolina, there was a group called MAP, the Metrolina AIDS Project. Metrolina being sort of the metro area. And the probation officer thought she said she was going to work for MAP, but she said she was going to work for MAPS. And so she got permission. So she worked off her entire probation working for MAPS on psychedelic stuff.
Oh, man. I'm going to out myself, but when I was in college, I got an MIP, right? So it's a drinking infraction. And I figured out that I could serve my community service by effectively being the booze runner at the local farmers market between the people at the bars and the people wanting food. And I got paid off in booze as a result.
Cool.
So I can
Skippy, that is really, 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 really impressive. All right, so I'm invited to give this talk to the Western IRB people who are on this, and I'm going to emphasize the importance of science guiding their decisions. And the night before, I'm at this reception, and the guy who wrote the letter giving us the money back was there. We started talking, and I said, do you think I could tell the story of what our history was? That you said no. And, then we had to find Copernicus. And after all these years, you bought Copernicus. And that's the only reason we're able to make progress is because it started with you blocking us. giving us permission. And then he said, well, no, that's kind of embarrassing. Some of the board members are here and, that might not be good for them. And I said, oh, okay, if that's what you're saying, But then in the morning, right before my talk, he came up to me and said, I thought about it. Go ahead and tell the whole story. And so that was one of the most beautiful full circle moments.
Yes.
Was where I could explain to all these people that really their job was to put science over religion and politics. And we needed them to do that. And that even the Western IRB had its problems with that, but had overcome it to the point where I could tell the story. It was fantastic.
That's a great full circle moment. And it's a perfect bridge because I want to get into kind of building bipartisan movements. And maybe a bridge into that is what you just described, something I've heard you talk about a lot. And I think it's related, but you'll be the judge of that, which is telling the truth on all sides.
That's actually what I learned from Sasha Shulgin, the brilliant chemist, the American version of Albert Hoffman, who sort of rediscovered MDMA. He would share what he learned with everybody. He would share it with the DEA. He would share it with underground chemists. He would make it public. He believed that information should be shared. So for example, some of the people that we work with at Lykos Therapeutics, the pharmaceutical company that MAPS catalyzed but is now only a minority owner of.
Formerly MAPS PBC.
Yeah, formerly MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. They're worried that MAPS's endorsement of ending the drug war will alienate FDA or DEA or somebody, and it'll make it difficult for them to make progress with the medical use of MDMA. So that's totally 100% wrong because of this idea of having been honest with people the whole time.
Yeah.
FDA has known from the very beginning, as has DEA, that I believe that we need two parallel strategies. One is drug development, the other is drug policy reform, and that what we need is global consciousness change. We need humanity to see its commonalities, to work together, to deal with income inequality, to deal with environmental problems, with species extinction and climate change and nuclear weapons and all of this, and that we need to really make this shift. And so from the very beginning, I've been clear that I have this parallel strategy. And the FDA has never really held it against me. They've known it the whole time. So it's just when you believe that certain people can't handle certain things or so. I just gave a talk to 60 police officers in Boston. I felt in the past like the police are the predator and I'm the prey. All criminals, you could say, are the prey, but drug users, feel that way too. Yeah. Even though we don't feel that we've done anything wrong. I felt that this talk to the police, though, was that more police commit suicide than die in the line of duty.
Yeah.
They have incredible problems with alcoholism, domestic violence, the stress of the work that they do. It's just, there was a critical moment where one of the police officers during the question period, after I explained where we were with MDMA and how this can be helpful for police to deal with their trauma, one of the police officers said, don't you think there's going to be a lot more problems if this is legal? People are going to be exposed to it because you're talking about giving it to people under direct supervision of therapists, and it's got to be done in that way. And you're also saying it's going to be legal. And so I said, there will be more problems that way. And it'll take a generation or so of honest drug education, of developing treatment on demand, of training people about peer support, of making sure that everybody has peer drugs before the risks are as minimized as they can be. There still will be risks. But the drug war is so counterproductive that if we could just switch in a second to legal access, it would be better. And that was a kind of a strange thing to tell to a bunch of police officers, some of whom had been narcotics police officers and were. Sure. I think they agreed with it, or they certainly didn't boo me out of there because, we have over 100,000 people die from opiate and fentanyl overdoses. It's clear that it's a failure. There was one other moment that happened in Denver where it was like speaking truth to all sides. At the Psychedelic Science 2023.
Amazing event.
Yeah, 12,400 people. But we had a dinner for over 1,000 people for the veterans. And before my time, many veterans, most of them are Republicans. And so before I was going to be one of the speakers, and I was introduced by someone that said I was a draft dodger. And I'm like, well, that's not the greatest thing to say to a bunch of veterans. So I got up and I said, I'm not actually a draft dodger. I'm a draft resistor. And I'm not a pacifist. And I believe that there are times when we really need to defend ourselves, like against Hitler or like against Putin in Ukraine. So I'm not a pacifist. Being a conscientious objector wasn't something that I could do, that I could honestly do. And so that's where I decided to go to jail. And I said that, I wasn't going to run away to Canada. And I wasn't going to, at the time, if you pretended you were homosexual or crazy, or sometimes people would shoot themselves in the foot. So I said I wasn't going to do any of this. You talk about how we have this bipartisan support, and that is very true. But I wanted to see, can we use this bipartisan support to talk about other issues that other than where we come together on psychedelic healing? It was one of the riskiest things I felt that I did at that entire conference. But it was well received. I thought, because these are people that volunteered and they were willing to make sacrifices for others. But I think this idea, being the same person in all the different environments that you may even be diplomatic. You don't have to be confronting everybody, but it's easier to feel like you don't have to modify your story and then remember who did you tell what to.
Yeah.
So I think it's a big part of the authenticity that people believe in.
Yeah. I've seen you do it. I mean, in settings as diverse as psychedelic sciences to Burning Man, saying things where I cringe, not because I don't agree, because I'm like, oh, is this going to fuck everything up? But it's so beautiful, like that you can own reality, and it's what trust comes from.
Yes. Now, let me guess, Skippy, at what you cringe about. So my guess is that it'll be about when I talk about adolescence and psychedelics for kids.
Oh, that actually wasn't it, but we could go there if you want to.
Well, what was it?
I think it's actually just how open you are about your own drug use. Those moments, I think, are the ones where I'm like, is he saying this now? Because it's not now. It was then. I know time has passed, but I think it's more those things that do that for me.
Those are easy because I think people are curious, particularly police when you talk about it, or all these people that have been miseducated about the risks of drugs and think that there's nothing good and they're all terrible, and they don't even know why people would do them,
right?
From what they've learned. So telling stories about how they were helpful. And the fact, I still managed to get a PhD from Harvard. I didn't totally fry my brain, or, I think that, again, that's part of this privilege. I think it's important for people to hear that kind of stuff.
I, for one, am just incredibly grateful for the work you've done over the entirety and more of my lifespan. So I want to pull out a few of the constituent parts of this journey that others may be able to implement on their own journeys that we probably don't even see yet because they're 38 years from completion, or in some ways from beginning. How can leaders who are listening right now support that mission in small and big ways?
The first step is to work on your own traumas. I mean, we see the world through a lens of trauma, through a lens of our past history, through prejudices. There is small groups of Israelis and Palestinians that were doing ayahuasca and MDMA together to try to, see each other from the other side as people, not just as, symbols of the enemy. Also in therapy, we call it therapists, the wounded healer, the person that worked through their own wounds and was able to heal emotionally, are now the best healers for other people. So I think leaders can do their own work. There's also more and more discussion about retreats with psychedelics where people can go not for spiritual experience or to work on trauma, but as work groups to try to, create bonding between teams or new ideas. At MAPS, one of the things that I'm very proud of is that our employee manual has what we call smokable tasks. Carl Hart, who's a neuroscientist, policy. Carl was on our board of directors for a while, and he encouraged us to do this. So I really attribute this to Carl Hart. But one of the things that I used to love to do was to smoke marijuana with people on the MAP staff, and we would strategize and we'd plan new things, brainstorming. So our employee manual says that there's a thing called smokable tasks. And if you and your manager think you're as good or better when you're high doing certain kind of things, then you can do drugs at work. It's not a problem at all. In fact, it's an advantage because it's about performance. It's not about state of consciousness. It's not about your drugs in your body. It's about performance. So smokable tasks is that. So I think leaders can, and so there are now more people talking about retreats for businesses, for corporate culture and for creativity and developing new ideas. So I think that's something people could think about doing.
Hmm.
And even in America, you could probably take a bunch of people to Oregon for the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative or bring them to Colorado.
Sure.
So I think one of the things leaders can do is to try to get people out to vote. I mean, that's a short-term thing, but I think it's critical. I think we are in this incredibly critical time. And just think about climate change. I mean, the more we ignore it, the more it gets worse.
Yeah.
People, wherever they are locally, you could work with, making mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority or do anything like that. So I think leaders can work on their own consciousness, work with teams, support policy change, and within their own institutions, try to practice what they police. Maybe you could sign up your company for ketamine for mental health, for depression, so that it's one of the things your company offers. There's a group called Enthea that's trying to work with companies to help manage plans for them to be offering ketamine and eventually MDMA and psilocybin, things like that.
Amazing. A lot of options there for folks. Okay, so you arguably start this journey at the most hyper-partisan moment for your issue possible, being demonized from the president at the White House, to a seminal moment at a Psychedelic Science 2023 conference, which is Democratic and Republican governors in Rick Perry and Jared Polis coming on back-to-back to share support. For someone trying to build a bipartisan movement, what are some of the key takeaways that you have learned along the way that they might try to implement?
Well, I'd say the most important one is to go to where the suffering is and to see if you can help. So, for example, right now, when we think about opiate overdoses, a lot of that is happening in the rural areas. Not only, it's happening in big cities too, but there's a lot of places where people have lost jobs, where they're called deaths of despair, which is suicide, alcoholism, and drug overdoses. What you need to do to build bipartisan support is people are most open when you're helping reduce suffering of different kinds. Where are the pain points and how can you help? And I think the other part is to separate out the people from the role. So I mentioned Frank Sapienza as someone who was involved with making MDMA illegal for the DEA. Recently, there was a woman named Rachel Newer who was writing a book called I Feel Love about MDMA. And she wanted to interview some of the people from the DEA who were involved in the criminalization. So I said, all right, I'll see if any of them are still alive. And it turned out I found Frank Sapienza on LinkedIn, no longer working for the DEA, but he consults with pharma companies to help them reschedule drugs. I wrote him a message on LinkedIn. I said, we haven't talked for over 35 years, but I knew that you were not against the therapeutic use. You told me that we took you by surprise. You just thought about it as ecstasy. I said, there's this woman who would like to write this book. Would you be willing to be interviewed by her for her book? And then also, would you be willing to work with our team to help us reschedule MDMA into a medicine? And the very next day, he wrote me back. We hadn't talked for over 35 years. He said, I remember you. I remember the whole story. I will be interviewed and I will work with your team.
Wow.
So I think this idea is that you see people as both who they are and also the role that they're in, and you can separate it.
Beautiful.
You try to reach them as their human part, and that's the way to really build bipartisan support for things. Even if you disagree, if people think that you are seeing them as a human, then you can build these bonds even if they're on opposite sides of different issues.
Yeah. Because I know that this has been a thing for you, having built the Public Benefit Corporation, now Lycos, and also the nonprofit. So many people I know in this space of systems reform are building organizations. And there's always a question of, should this be for-profit or nonprofit? And they get really stuck in that, and it's really hard to tease out. You've done both. You've injected the same source code into each, and you've seen how they evolved.
Yeah.
What have you learned about how the profit motive or organizational underpinning of an organization can change what it becomes, not necessarily good or bad, but just so people can make a more informed decision about something that may come later on?
Well, I think the pure profit motive, which you could say is the engine of capitalism, it's like growth at all costs. That also is very much like cancer. And often you can end up, cancer kills the host. So I think that the public benefit corporation is a healthy modification of capitalism. There's something about, we all need to make a living, and there is something important about making money. Even at nonprofits, you need people who've made money to give you the money so that you can pay salaries and do things. But I think that the public benefit corporation permits people to not just maximize profits, and they're insulated against shareholder lawsuits if you don't maximize profits because you've got other mission, which is part of this public benefit. But I would say that I've learned that public benefit is hollow unless it's implemented. Just to be a public benefit corp doesn't mean much. You have to actually live it and act it. I think one of the things that I'm saying now is that Lycos will go to where the suffering is, but where the money is also. Now, they will have a patient assistance program to help people who can't afford it, but it's going to be small compared to the number of people that pay for it. So that Lycos will go to where the suffering is, where people can pay. And MAPS, the nonprofit, will go to where the suffering is, but where people can't pay.
Yeah.
And so we will be sort of seeking philanthropy at MAPS for bringing MDMA to Somaliland, Rwanda. We're working with Syrian refugees in Denmark, to Palestine, to Israel, to Rwanda, so many places, Bosnia. Most of the places we're going to go are not going to have the resources to really cover it. And then also a lot of them will be refugees and migrants. MAPS has raised about 155 million in donations, which is pretty enormous. But it's over a long period of time. But in the past couple of years, around $3 billion has been raised for for-profit psychedelic companies.
Wow.
So there is access to capital that comes from being for-profit that dwarfs usually the access to capital for nonprofits. It's a difficult decision on how people want to go, but I'm really looking forward to working in a more nonprofit context at MAPS. And I also have seen the profit motive at Lycos, where it's now got to balance public benefit against return to shareholders. And there are certain compromises that are made that I would not made if it had been entirely funded by donors.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We were destroyed by our own success in a sense that so many people had now all these for-profit companies. People are like, why should I donate? Now you've got all these opportunities for investment. So we ended up needing to take investors. So in general, I would just say that there's fit for purpose. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And it might better be accomplished in a public benefit corp way or in a nonprofit. You have to really decide. But both can be very legitimate.
And now a quick break from our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show. Leadership is about making tough calls under pressure. The key is knowing who to trust. When Aspen faced short-term rental and zoning challenges, I turned to Skyrun Vacation Rentals in Aspen. They gave it to me straight and trusted me to do what was best for our community. With their help, we crafted balanced regulations that strengthened our economy, supported locals, and preserved our character. If you need expert guidance in a time of STR or zoning challenge, give them a call. And to experience their commitment to community and care in Colorado, don't take it from me, use code HOP15, that's Healing Our Politics 15, for 15% off a stay, whether for yourself or someone in your community. There's a link in the show notes. Feel free to pass it along. This episode is brought to you by Moon Song Fund, platinum level donor to the Elected Leaders Collective Foundation. This content would not be possible without donors just like you. If you want to see more of this content, helping more leaders heal themselves, their communities, and our world, please go to www.electedleaderscollective.com and click donate, always 501c3, tax deductible. The Healing Our Politics podcast is brought to you by the Elected Leaders Collective, the first leading and most highly recognized name in mental health, well-being, and performance coaching for elected leaders and public servants, designed specifically for you. Now, don't be fooled by the name. The Elected Leaders Collective is not just for elected leaders. It is for all public servants, staffers, volunteers, government, nonprofit, whole organizations. This is for you. If you are filled with passion for improving your community and world, but are tired, as I am, of the anger, stress, and vitriol, If you find yourself banging your head against that same wall, struggling with the incoming criticism and threats, arguing with colleagues who are supposed to be on your team, and questioning if it's even worth it anymore, then the Elected Leaders Collective programming is specifically for you. With the Elected Leaders Collective, you will learn to become a hashtag political healer, building the authentic, unshakable confidence and courage to stay true to yourself through the anger and pressure, while cultivating the open, empathetic mind to meet others with the curiosity, compassion, and kindness necessary to respond to threats, improve challenging relationships, de-escalate conflict, and bring people in your community together to solve real problems and get shit done. You'll reduce stress, anxiety, and overwhelm and become a more effective leader while having time for your family, yourself, your health, and your wealth, sleeping well at night, and showing others they can too. Now that's leadership. Healing Our Politics listeners receive 10% off all Elected Leaders Collective services using the code hashtag political healer. Use it today and become one of the brave political leaders healing our politics. Use code hashtag political healer by going to www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. That's www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. What was that? Oh, this is the time when we switch the episode. Okay, jumping to the future. Come along with us. Don't mind the sound of the chair. Let's go. Okay, we had the great fortune to sit down at length previously. And then right before we were going to release the episode, the FDA decision dropped. And there's just been a lot going on in the psychedelic ecosystem. And of course, now we are already, which seems crazy to me, coming up on PS25. I feel like PS23 was yesterday.
Well, I was just working with Jason Silva, and I've asked him to make this image that will play behind a part of my opening talk at Psychedelic Science 2025. After the FDA rejection, which was heartbreaking, it felt like in the myth of the Phoenix that we were at the stage of having been burnt to the crisp.
Yeah.
And now what I realized after a month or two that changed my mood pretty much entirely was that even if MAPS and Lycos both would disappear, that the psychedelic ecosystem was moving forward, that the research was moving forward. There was so much going on all over the world and so much bipartisan support and so many stories in so many different ways and so much for-profit psychedelic companies that I felt like this ecosystem had been launched.
Yeah.
And it was moving forward. So the image was of this psychedelic phoenix being burnt to a crisp and then starting to reconstitute in some sort of a new way. So that's one of the opening images that we'll try to present at Psychedelic Science 2025, that we've been through this bruising period, highly disappointing period, but that we're still moving forward, still standing.
Yeah. As that decision was happening, I was going through my psychedelic facilitator training at Naropa and then at Intertrek in Oregon. And so I found myself immersed in a group of folks who really wanted to contribute to this ecosystem and be healers. I found, and this is a personal judgment, but I found that the perspectives of folks, while I could understand them, seemed to be, they had psychedelic mastery, but political naivete. And I wonder if you're being really honest, because you had decades of setbacks.
Yeah.
What was your perspective going in? Did you think it was a slam dunk like so many others did?
No, I didn't. The diagnosis that I would make is that it began as MAPS, the nonprofit. And that was the way it was for 28 years, entirely funded by donations. And so that's where we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. That meant that there could be this period of 5 years where MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, wholly owned by the nonprofit, would have a monopoly position, and that we could sell MDMA for more than it costs, more than it would be as a generic, but we would be using the profits for more research, for patient assistance programs, for training therapists, things like that.
Yeah.
A couple of years goes by, and now we sort of showed that there is a way to go through the FDA, that they're not 100% opposed to these things, that we got permission in 2016 to go to phase 3. We negotiated the phase 3 design with FDA in 2017, got what's called an agreement letter and a special protocol assessment. And by that point, there had been the launching now of some of these for-profit psychedelic companies. And their stocks were going way up. And it became difficult, impossible, unfortunately, for me to raise the rest of the money that we needed by donations. So we took in investors.
Because that capital was competing for a similar outcome, but that had a return?
Yeah, you could say, I think one of the more misguided statements was by someone who said, philanthropy is only for things that you can't fund other ways. So I think in part that's true. Philanthropy is only for things that you can't fund other ways, or if you fund them other ways, it changes what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that part was missing. So when we took in investors, then they wanted more and more separation between MAPS and the for-profit, MAPS Public Benefit Corp. And then since I didn't know commercialization, Amy Emerson didn't know commercialization, we knew drug development, we made the mistake of relying on experts who just proposed the traditional way to do things.
And Amy Emerson, who you're mentioning, former CEO of Lycos, or the for-profit side.
Yeah, she was sort of in charge of the research at MAPS. And then when we created the MAPS Public Benefit, we put her as the executive director.
Yeah.
So what happened, though, was that we had traditional pharma people, more and more hired, more and more separation from MAPS, and they tried to do what they claimed was a traditional pharma approach, which was the quiet period, which means as you get closer to submitting all your data to FDA, and when the FDA is reviewing it, that you don't pay any attention to media, you don't pay any attention to critics, you don't pay any attention, you have a quiet period.
What's the underlying theory of that? Why have they found that, or why do they believe that's been successful in other instances?
Well, keep in mind, these are new drugs that nobody's ever heard of, that they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they don't want to get FDA upset, or whatever. But it's a dramatic failure when it's a drug like MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy or Molly.
That comes with a whole history of preconception.
Yeah. So the fundamental mistake that they made was to think, they is now the pharma people running Lycos and controlling the MAPS board, actually, to get us to follow what Lycos wanted, which was a disaster. The idea that they thought that we'd reached a point where the only thing that mattered was the data, that this was a rational process. And yeah, we'd worked for 37 years or so to get to that point, but it was never just a rational process. If it was a rational process, psychedelic research would have been wiped out for multiple decades.
Yeah.
It's not just about the data. Then this idea of the quiet period, it started in March 2023 when there was a critique of the therapeutic method. And I was like, okay, it's fine. Science is based on criticism. You're trying to disprove hypotheses. That's how science evolves. But in this case, I was saying, we need to respond to the critics. And Lycos didn't, and they blocked MAPS from doing that. Later, I've had a chance to talk to some of those people, and they felt that their points were being ignored, and they became ever more aggressive or energetic trying to get their points across. So there was this Institute for Clinical and Effectiveness Research, which is funded by the insurance companies, and their job is to figure out what's a cost-effective price for new drugs. And they were looking at MDMA. And Lycos decided not to communicate with them. And they wrote in their report, Lycos didn't communicate with us. And so it was very, very negative. Questioning the double blind, questioning the therapeutic approach, things that had been bubbling up that we should have responded to a lot sooner.
Yeah, there was an opportunity that was missed in retrospect.
Well, so what happened was the narrative, the control of the narrative was lost. The main message is if you are going to be an innovator, if you're going to innovate new, you have a constant challenge to educate people about what this new land looks like that you're sailing towards. FDA doesn't regulate psychotherapy, but they don't need to. FDA has never approved psychedelic with a therapy. So you're constantly needing to do this proactive education. And when you don't respond to critics, people think, well, they're right. You know, this was the attitude at Lycos. We don't want to respond to critics because it'll bring more attention to the criticism. That's true if you're defensive, if you don't think you've got a good response to the criticism. But if you've got a good response, then you want people to pay attention to the criticism, and you want them to see your response, and you want them to conclude that you've got a reasonable response. So the whole narrative was changed in the negative, and The other part is that the people that we made the discussions with in 2017 at the FDA about how to design the study, the people at FDA that chose therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA, those people left the FDA and new people took over at the Division of Psychiatry, and they were more conservative. So there was this need for proactive education that Lykos didn't do. So people will say, oh, it's the critics. The critics caused this to go down, criticizing the therapy, the double blind, the functional unblinding, all of this. But I don't think that's the real story. I think that the real story is that the critics carried the day because there was no response.
Yeah, and I love that response too, because it mirrors the embodiment of what the medicine often teaches you, which is personal responsibility. We can't control things outside of ourselves, but like, what could we have done differently? How might we act differently in the future to get a better result? I think it's a beautiful opportunity to own and move forward, which is all we can do.
Yeah.
By the way, when you say conservative, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said more conservative members. Yeah. I took that to mean people who are more resistant to dramatic change or just change in understanding as opposed to politically conservative. Is that true or not?
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. But in the way conservatives, you want to conserve the old ways in a sense.
Sure.
So these are people that weren't ready to help pioneer the FDA into figuring out new ways to regulate something that they've never regulated before, which is psychedelic assisted therapy. Because we do have bipartisan support. That's really important to say. Right. Rick Perry is coming back to psychedelic science 2025, former governor of Texas in Trump's first cabinet. There is this sense that when institutions like the FDA are confronting something new that they've never done before, you can't just say, we'll give the FDA what they want, because the FDA doesn't know what they want.
Correct. I mean, this really is a paradigmatic shift in the way that we apply treatment, that the FDA understands, the mental health understands. And this was my point when I spoke to folks in my program. And it's funny you say Rick Perry, because I was with Rick at a conference fairly recently, and he was talking about his expectation outside of anything psychedelic, but just anything that is new, not well understood, within the context of the Texas state legislature is going to take 3 sessions, right? So well over a year. And that mirrors my experience at the legislative level as well. If something's new, even if it's great, if people don't get it, the potential risk that they perceive, the reputational harm, or just the lack of understanding, these things really do take time. What I'm hearing from you is like, this sucks. This hurt. This is something that will set back the movement. It will probably cost lives and a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
But it is part of the process, and the process is forward regardless of the outcome. I'm curious how you personally dealt with this. What were your stages of processing?
What's not known that well is that I'd been battling Lykos for a long time about what I saw was this excessive risk aversion and traditional approach. For example, June 4th was the FDA Advisory Committee saying we don't recommend. June 6th was the Dutch State Commission on MDMA. That was their equivalent of the FDA Advisory Committee, except for the fact that they had a year to work on it, to look at the data that the FDA Advisory Committee had a couple weeks. They had real subject matter experts. And they had to write a report to justify their findings. It couldn't be just like, oh, I don't know what's going on. I worry about this. I vote no. So this report came out June 6th, and it came to the exact opposite conclusions of the FDA Advisory Committee 2 days forward. And the Lykos people chose not to let people know about it. It was just a fundamental strategic mistake because it was the science criticism. And you'll know this from trying to impact legislatures and all, that you need the political approach, but you also need the data.
Sure.
You need your argument and you need your power players, you could say.
Yeah.
One without the other doesn't work. So what Lykos ended up doing was trying this political approach between the 2 months between FDA Advisory Committee saying no and the FDA saying no. And they got 19 senators and 61 members of the House to say, write a letter to the president, head of the FDA, this is important, approve this, veterans need it. They didn't go after the critiques made of the protocol, and the FDA wants to see themselves as a science-based organization, not as politicians and other companies can just push it around. So there wasn't a vigorous explanation of how we arrived at the protocol design that the FDA selected with the inactive placebo. There wasn't a real explanation about what the therapy method was and all the fidelity ratings, information to show that people tried just as hard with the placebo group as with the MDMA group. So that there was just this growing sense of lost opportunities and of not really responding. So a growing sense of gloom and doom, you could say. And so how I personally dealt with it is, first off, I was like, I told you so. That doesn't accomplish all that much. And it's sore comfort, you could say, cold comfort.
Mm. How did you exhume yourself from the heartbreak? Was it just time? Was there any active practice? Was there a reminder of bringing yourself back to past setbacks? Like anything that others could apply in their own setbacks?
Well, you have to pretty much feel the sadness of it, not to push that off. But the thing that sort of got me out of it was the daily work on new paths forward, even if it was sort of so slow. It wasn't as terrible as it could have been because I didn't come at it with the belief that it was definitely going to happen, that the FDA would definitely approve.
Yeah.
I think what's harder to take is when you are convinced of something's going to happen and then it doesn't happen.
For sure.
But I think that time to mourn and to just let the sadness sink in is really important.
Yeah. And you very much opened with the wider view here of even if it's not us, everything is moving forward. And that's clear and beautiful. And
yes.
For you moving forward, what is that process and timeline like now?
Here's one way to say this, is that Lykos is a for-profit company. Their investors are coming in with their foundations. They're not trying to maximize profits. They're doing it with public benefit, but they still need to pay attention to business aspects of it. So Lykos will take MDMA where the suffering is, where the money is.
Mm-hmm.
MAPS is going to try to take MDMA to where the suffering is, but where there is no money. Meaning that we'll operate on philanthropy. So MAPS is trying to set up 5 or 6 or so demonstration projects of MDMA-assisted therapy research in different high trauma, low resource countries. We've got a project in Somaliland that's underway. Just came back from Ukraine. We're trying to start research in Ukraine. We're leaving in a few hours for Beirut, for Lebanon. We're going to try to bring MDMA therapy to the Arab world. We've got stuff in Israel. We're going to try to start some projects in South America and Central America. So I want to demonstrate over the next couple of years, 5 or 6 of these sort of pilot projects. So there's several things that are super interesting about this. First off, we're going into places where there's not a lot of therapists and psychiatrists.
Yeah.
So who are the healers? Somebody even suggested we train midwives. And it's a very great metaphor of the skills you need to be a midwife. You're not the woman giving birth. You're not thinking, I'm doing it. We're helping people heal themselves. A midwife, you're helping someone else give birth. You don't take credit, I didn't do it. So the essence of our method is that we're helping patients to heal themselves.
Yeah.
So in any case, whether it's clergymen or midwives or nurses or whatever few psychiatrists and therapists they are, we're going to have to find new healers. But then the other part is going to be group therapy. These people are often migrants, refugees, traumatized together.
Yeah.
And then the other part that's sort of groundbreaking is particularly important is moving down the age spectrum and to start working with people closer to the trauma, meaning adolescents or even children that have been traumatized and not waiting for them to get to be 18 and then treating them.
Yeah, I was just going to give the listener 2 places to look if they wanted to educate themselves more deeply on what you're talking about. First, talking about sort of those international audiences. There was a great talk that you hosted at PS23 or Psychedelic Science 23 2 years ago now, wild, featuring Lior Rosenthal and Semi Awad, who are working with ex-combatants from Palestine and Israel in healing circles, in that case using ayahuasca as a sacrament, but another psychedelic medicine.
It's Lior Roseman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gosh. Their work is definitely worth checking out. And then I recently saw the release of the study from We Shall Dance Again,
yes,
which is from the Nova Festival, where the October 7th and then the war that is currently happening began. There were people who were using substances, including but not limited to MDMA, during that festival at the time of the attack. And so this study looks at the inoculating effect or potential effect of those substances at the time of the trauma. So really going back to square one. I think it might be an interesting thing for people to check out as well.
Well, what they showed is there was 3,000 or 4,000 people at this event. Around 75% of them were on psychedelics. Around 25% were not. So they divided up those people that were on MDMA, those people that were on LSD or psilocybin, more the classic psychedelics, those people who were on nothing. What they showed is that those people that had MDMA had fewer PTSD symptoms. But the other thing that you mentioned is combatants. The leading group in Israel for peace was called Peace Now. And they've been arguing for a two-state solution for a long time. And they've been diminishing with their public support over time, unfortunately. And some of the people that were very much involved with Peace Now have gone to work with what's called combatants for peace. So these are Israeli soldiers or Palestinian terrorists, however you want to talk about them, freedom fighters, whatever, who have given up violence and have adopted a strategy of nonviolence. And we had one of them from Palestine was going to come to Psychedelic Science. We'd invited him. He was going to be on a panel to present the talk. And I just learned a couple of days ago that the State Department denied him a visa.
Wow.
So he cannot come. So, I've appealed through some of the channels that I know to see if that can be changed. But it's just heartbreaking that you would have someone from Palestine that's committed to nonviolence after having been an advocate of violence, wanting to tell their story and being denied entry into the United States.
Yeah, it just speaks to the barriers, real and invented, that we need to traverse to make meaningful change in our world. So I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but you're talking about the structure of Lycos and MAPS and how the money behind it is ultimately what drives how it acts in the world and what it prioritizes. And we were just talking about We Will Dance Again, which was also an art exhibit at Burning Man this year, where we were both at. And it was, I get choked up even thinking about it now, but some of the folks who had been at that atrocity rebuilt the same piece of art and shade structure that was there during this attack. And at the moment, the same time of day of that attack, they replayed the DJ set. And these people came there and basically affirmed, like, you can try to take our lives, but you can't take our lives and you can't take our joy.
It was beautiful. So at 6 a.m., they had a memorial service on Saturday, Shabbat, for those people that were killed. Around 359 people were killed and 100 or so were abducted. And then at 6:29, when the music stopped from the Hamas attack, they started the music at the note that had been stopped. It was very inspiring, this idea that we will dance again. But I think the way that they'll dance again is when they dance with Palestinian partners. Yeah. It's going to be it's a dance of death right now.
My understanding is that following us running into each other there and exchanging this really moving moment, through the magic that happens on the playa, you run into an individual who may have an effect on the funding and thus the focus going forward. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah. So I had officiated a wedding for the first time in my life at Burning Man on the Thursday night. And afterwards we went to the camp. And this was a camp that a fellow named Antonio Gracias was with. He had previously donated $1 million to MAPS for our capstone campaign to raise money for Phase 3. He donated, I think, $16 million to Harvard for pan-psychedelic activities between the law school, the divinity school, the business school, arts and sciences. And he was there. And he was on the other side of the room. And when I finally got free, he was gone. So I figured, okay, I've lost my chance to talk to Antonio. Then I get up early in the morning to see the sunrise, to see the ceremony. And at 6:29, as we said, the dancing starts and thousands of people are dancing. Who should be dancing right next to me but Antonio? And this is a couple weeks after the FDA rejection.
It should also just be said, for someone who doesn't have a visual or any understanding of what this place is like, the size of the playa or the area where Burning Man takes place is, if you're familiar with Chicago, it's like South Loop to River North. Like, this is a huge area that has almost 80,000 people. And this man is now next to you. So just like take that in.
Yeah, complete coincidence. And what he turned to me and he said is, I just want you to know it's not your fault, this FDA rejection. He said, it's the traditional pharma people who did this traditional approach. And I said, you're right. I agree with you. It's not my fault. But then we had a conversation and he was basically saying, let's just let them go bankrupt and then we'll start over. And I said, they're not going to go bankrupt, but we do need to start over. And then months went by, and it turned out that there was this term sheet to raise money to prevent them from going bankrupt. It was very punitive. And that's where I contacted Antonio and said, we need a white knight to come help us refocus back towards public benefit. So Burning Man played a key role, and synchronicity, or however you want to say it, there we were dancing right next to each other.
And what do you anticipate will be the shift or outcome from that coincidence for the organization moving forward, if you know?
Well, I think there's two people, Antonio Gracias and Christopher Hahn, who's a hedge fund philanthropist, who are going to be taking over operational control over Lykos. And I think that they're going to be more focused on public benefit. They're going to be more focused on a smart strategic approach dealing with FDA, basically saying that the data is good. There's all these questions, but we think we should go forward with approval. And if there is more data to be gathered, let's do it in what's called a phase 4 approach, meaning post-approval, but you still gather stuff. And that usually is like real-world evidence, open label. So I think that MDMA will eventually become a medicine, either within around 6 months, or if there is no phase 3 study required, or within 3.5 years or so if a phase 3 study is required.
When will you know what that requirement or request is on the FDA? Well, sorry, not you. When will the organization know? And I'm sure they'll tell you.
I think they'll know in a couple of months. Could take even more. I mean, I think some of the issues, Lykos has said that they're going to be reviewing. They put out a press release saying that they're going to be reviewing all the study data. That I think will be important to show to the FDA to say this data is reliable.
Yeah. So the path forward is forward, months to years, but a lot less than forever. A hopeful reinvigoration of public benefit into the ethos. And then on the MAP side of things, this idea of net zero trauma, is that still alive and kicking?
Oh, yeah. So within a couple of years, MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD should be approved by FDA. So what's the larger vision? The larger vision is this global mental health.
Yeah.
And one way to express that is net zero trauma. It just means that there's two kinds of trauma, basically traumas you experience in your life and epigenetic traumas that are passed through the cell lines.
Which, if anyone's interested in that, Dr. Dave Rabin is on the show. You can go back and find his episode, and he talks a lot about this work, and Dr. Rachel Yehuda and a bunch of other research. So you can go check that out.
Yeah, so net zero trauma, making it so we're not adding to the burden of trauma every year. There'll always be trauma. There's always going to be death and accidents and illness. And so there's always going to be tragedy and sadness and trauma. And actually, we can learn from it. There's a measure we use called post-traumatic growth inventory. People can learn and grow from trauma.
Yeah.
But it's going to be a situation where MAPS is going to focus a lot around the world. It's really to try to customize the treatments for local conditions to promote better outcomes. Because what's really clear is that it's not in the drug itself. It's in the therapeutic context. So one of the big criticisms that was made at the FDA Advisory Committee meeting was 40% of the people had already done MDMA. That were in our study, and therefore they're biased. They wouldn't be volunteering if they didn't like MDMA, and so the idea is they're going to have fewer side effects and they're going to have better outcomes. So my attitude is that's a completely legitimate question to raise. However, when you look at the data, the 60% that had never done MDMA before were the same statistically, both on safety and on efficacy. So that's not true. But the main point that's often missed is 40% had done MDMA and they still had PTSD. It's not that the pill is the automatic cure for PTSD. It's the context within which you take it. It's your willingness to look at difficult experiences. It's your willingness to explore the most painful moments that have happened in your life.
Yeah. And this is the thing, if you haven't experienced it, that I think is just so challenging for the traditional Western American mind to understand, that we're so used to breaking things down in a reductionist cause and effect way that is passive, when in fact we are talking about the relationality between many things and the doors that this compound opens up in those relational dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a physiological effect for sure. You know, during the AIDS crisis, one of our fundraisers, who's no longer with us, though, said that he and his friends worked out their grief on the dance floor with ecstasy. So even these kind of therapeutic situations that we think of traditionally with you're on a couch or in a hospital therapist room and stuff, that you can have therapeutic experiences that are in these group celebratory contexts, which is one of the reasons why we believe that they should be legal as well as the medical context.
Yeah.
But it all speaks to this sense that there is new kind of context are the most important thing. So there's a lot of psychedelic companies, these for-profit companies, that are about tweaking different molecules and getting them to be more effective, particularly like with ibogaine, to try to make it so that you have the psychological effects without the effect on the heart. This idea that there's new molecules is interesting, but it's really new social context that we need. We have an abundance of riches in the existing molecules that we already know about. And the real cutting edge is developing new social contexts where they can be legally used. And so I'm not that excited or so about all these companies trying to look at new drugs. But if they can tinker with some of them and develop better ones, all the better. I'm not saying that research shouldn't take place. But I just think that the movement that we need is in legal context, is political, is social, is with the FDA. How do we create access?
Yeah. And I would imagine if you're looking for a silver lining, even if you're resistant to those types of approaches to these medicines, they will certainly have a aggregate normalizing effect to this type of medicine by having more players in the field, more interests involved, which would make the approval or moving forward of the type of approach that you're looking for to become more likely.
Yeah. Regulators don't like being the only ones doing things. That's why international research is really important, but the FDA is a big one for precedent.
Yeah. Are there any other things that you have coming up in the future of MAPS or that you're currently working on that you're really excited about and you want people to know about?
One of them is this cannabis project, Colorado being cannabis state. We have $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan to study PTSD in 320 veterans with cannabis. Now, cannabis is palliative, not potentially curative, the way MDMA can be. It's the kind of thing you need to take every day, more or less. If you stop taking it, your problems often come back. They're just covering up symptoms. But everybody who uses cannabis for PTSD in America does so where they have to pay for it themselves. It's not covered by insurance. And if we can take it through the FDA, then it can be covered by insurance. So we've just had a whole big formal dispute with FDA. They didn't want us to study smoked marijuana. They didn't want us to study vaporized marijuana. They didn't want us to have patients adjust a dose called patient self-titration according to what they want or need that day. We had this formal dispute with FDA. We won that. It took us $300,000 about. And now we've opened it up for the entire field. It can study smoked and vaporized with patient self-titration. So the other part is MAPS has just started a project at Columbia that is it's a survey and interview study of underground MDMA therapists around the world who use MDMA for couples therapy. So to try to really get the sense of what are the best ways to employ MDMA in couples therapy. One of the challenges has been trying to figure out what's the outcome measure. Some of these studies, the outcomes are the satisfaction with the relationship. But let's say people decide they're not suited and they decide to split up.
Sure.
So you can't have a measure that's just, do they stay together, how happy they are with this relationship. In a broader sense, when you're doing couples therapy, it's very possible that they might decide to separate, and that if that's done in a mutual way, that could be another way of success.
I see what you're saying.
So MAPS is doing that. We're working on protocol design for a couples therapy project that would take place in San Diego and possibly also in Austin. It would be really groundbreaking. FDA has never approved a psychiatric drug for anything other than conditions that are in the DSM, like depression, anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, ADHD. But there's nothing in the law that prevents the FDA from approving MDMA for couples therapy. It just sort of gets in this legalization way where you're approving it for a non-diagnosable situation. Political problems that block research.
Yes. On the couples therapy piece, I don't know if you would be willing to share this or not, but I think one of the biggest misunderstandings in the whole mental health sphere, and Jamie and I, my partner, both being coaches, we see this a lot. People think, I only need support if I'm in crisis. And it's like, actually, no, you need to be doing daily exercise so you don't arrive at crisis. And so there's a reason to be doing couples work, whatever that looks like to you, in a healthy relationship. And my understanding is you have a process with your own wife. Would you be willing to tell us about that?
Well, we just try to take MDMA together once a year.
And what do you do in that container?
Well, we just take a couple days out. We just take time with each other and talk about stuff. And then It's very important for people to realize that even when we talk about using MDMA in therapy, it's a 2-day thing, not 1 day. The first day to do it and the second day to reflect on it, to rest and reflect and integrate. And this therapist come back to people the day after. So, when we like to do it, it's like to take several days so that you're not driving the next day. Wherever you take it, you're just planted there for a couple days.
Does it matter where? Is it in the home? Are you in nature? Does it change?
We've done it in different places. I'm better than my wife at ignoring all the things that need to be done at home. So that when you're doing it at home, you don't think, oh, God, I didn't fix that, or I got to take out the garbage, or I got to do this or that, or that windowsill I should have cleaned there. For me, I can just be there and focus on the relationship, whereas for her, it's been a little bit harder to do it at home where she's got this checklist. So often we'll go to a retreat center, someplace where it can be private, bring the massage table, really have a sweet time together. And I think that we're still engaged in this idea of mainstreaming psychedelics. It's not quite done. We don't have anything approved yet. There's not tens of thousands of psychedelic clinics yet. So how do you win the popular support? One of the things, as we've talked about before, is bipartisan support through working with veterans. But the other is, what do people care about the most? They care about their love relationships. If we can show that MDMA-assisted therapy can be helpful in those kind of couples therapy, people are just going to really want to explore it. The other part is you help people's kids. And we saw this with cannabis, with CBD, helping with childhood epilepsy, and Sanjay Gupta's series on marijuana in CNN, where one of them focused on cannabis for childhood epilepsy. And then you have all of a sudden public support for it. I think that couples therapy is going to be a real popular area to study. And then you can even think broader to what we talked about before with Leo Roseman, this couples therapy for cultures in conflict, like Israelis and Palestinians, or Russians and Ukrainians, or Democrats and Republicans, to how to help lower your barriers, lower your fears, see people who they really are, search for common ground.
Yeah. Other than setting aside the time and creating a place where you're both comfortable and non-distracted, do you do anything in preparation to improve like safety psychologically or physically, hydration, diet, environment, anything like that?
One of the things that's good is to think about what the issues are that you want to talk about ahead of time. But then it's very important to rip up that list right before you do the MDMA. You can have all these intentions, and that's a good way to set the stage for things. But then you just throw it away and you see what comes. It's trusting the process. It's opening up to what's emerging. It's supporting what's emerging. So I think preparation is really, really helpful. But then you just throw it away and see what happens.
What harm might come from bringing like the list into the session, or what might be suboptimal?
Well, the problems that you think or the issues that you think, there may be deeper issues underlying them. And if you just focus on the ones that you're conscious of that you talked about, you're maybe limiting yourself. So here's a good example. It's kind of extreme example of a soldier that was a bunch of his fellow soldiers were killed, machine gunned in their beds by an infiltrator body. So under the influence of MDMA, he starts talking about how these people were murdered in their beds and how terrible that was and how they were helpless. And if they'd been murdered while they were on patrol, that would have been a different story, but they were murdered when they were resting and helpless. And then he said, when I was young, my father used to beat me up and I felt helpless. So it was that pivot to this deeper level of what was really going on in his psyche. That his pattern responses, this whole idea that he's traumatized because they were helpless, he's relating that to himself when he was younger, being beaten by his father. That's the idea, though, that there's this archaeology of trauma, and that our conscious mind might think we know what we need to do, but then you throw it out and you deal with it, whatever emerges.
Yeah, makes sense.
After Psychedelic Science 2023, I decided to try 5-MeO vape pens. And I was in the middle dose, and it took me right back to a trauma from over 40 years ago that I hadn't really processed or I hadn't processed fully. I never would have predicted that, that I need to work on this, or that it's just this opening that you get into the unknown from psychedelics, reduction of fear in the amygdala. You can end up getting at deeper issues. So that's what I'd say. It's not so much harm, but it's potentially distracting from where you would benefit the most from.
Makes sense. And then on day 2, when you're processing together, how do you do that? What does that look like?
Well, we tend to sleep a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and really rest a lot of it. And the rest of the time, we're just reviewing what happened before, talking, writing. I don't journal so much. I prefer to talk.
Mm-hmm.
It could be making art. It could be any number of things to help integrate it. But it's really more just giving ourselves the luxury of time. I mean, in all of our years, for many people, we don't really take time off. When we do, we keep working a lot of times. So I think it's a gift to yourself to think of MDMA as a 2-day experience, the second day to rest and reflect. And, now some people take 5-HTP to rebuild serotonin. I don't use that. We don't use that in the research. It's just never seemed necessary. There's no more low mood in the MDMA group than in the people that got therapy without MDMA at all.
Yeah, it's just a lot of mental processing. So there's going to be a dip thereafter. Is it important for you and your wife to come to any new agreements, actions, anything like that? Or is it just as it comes?
Well, it raises an important point. We don't think people should make decisions while they're under the influence of MDMA. You can explore different options. That's really what it's good for. But you should wait till the next day or a week or so after to make any momentous decisions. It also makes it more of an exploratory mood during the MDMA. You can explore all different things because you're not committing to make any of them happen. You're just exploring it, and then later on you can make the final decision.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. PS25. What is it? Where is it? Why should I go? Why should anyone care?
It's going to be the entire ecosystem coming together in Denver, June 16th to the 20th. The 16th and 17th are workshops. The 18th, 19th, and 20th are the actual presentations from over 400 speakers. It'll be the second largest psychedelic conference ever held in history. The first one was Psychedelic Science 2023 with 12,400 people.
Wow.
We're really excited in that we have the executive director of the American Psychiatric Association, a senior person for the American Psychological Association. And then we have the president of the National Association of Social Workers. We have Rick Perry, Kirsten Sinema, the former senator from Arizona. We have Jack Bergman, who's in the House trying to head the caucus on psychedelic therapies. Morgan Luttrell, who's the one that really inspired Rick Perry to be involved. We have Sharif El-Nahal, who is the number 2 person at the VA under Biden. We have all sorts of researchers and therapists and people talking about neuroscience, and there'll be 10 simultaneously tracks. So it's going to be this embarrassment of riches of the content. Lots of opportunities for socializing. We call that the hallway track. A lot of people come to these conferences and hardly get to any studies, get any talks.
Totally. And the hallways, if I remember from PS23, are a very entertaining place to be. You see a true kaleidoscope of humanity in all of its forms.
Sort of the crossroads of the psychedelic community. Lots of organizations are sort of building some of their meetings around it. It will be a joyous celebration of the fact that we're still moving forward. We're calling it the integration. So it's about how do we really integrate. Now we've been through this new drug application. It didn't work as we hoped, but we'll continue until it works. And so it's about teaching integration, the conference, various musical events, all sorts of things for people to do and network with other people.
Are there any talks or presentations or workshops that you are just like personally really excited about? Can't wait to see?
There's so much going on that I don't even have a faint idea of all the studies that are even happening.
Totally.
So there's Nolan Williams is coming to talk about the Ibogaine work. He gave a really great TED talk. It was the first time, by the way, at TED that they had a main stage talk on psychedelics.
Really?
In 6 years. Mine was the first in 2019, and then it took all the way to 2025 for them to invite Nolan Williams to give a talk.
Interesting. That's surprising.
Yeah, it is surprising. What I'm particularly interested in learning about is group therapy process. There'll be presentations by Christopher from the Portland, Oregon VA, workshops with holotropic breath work, lead therapists, with Bill Richards and others talking about psilocybin. There's a lot of opportunities for people to go in deep in the first 2 days of the conference, and incredible embarrassment of riches of talks about all different topics all over the world. I do hope that one of the overarching messages from me is going to be that the field is getting, I think, the wrong message, this idea to go forward without therapy.
Hmm.
And that really we should go forward with therapy because that's what's best for patients. When you think about it, it should be best for the bottom line of the companies too, because there's 13 million PTSD patients. I mean, there's an unending supply of PTSD patients and people with depression.
Yeah.
And so the idea that, that you can't optimize for what's best for patients because you'll run out of patients is totally false.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, having just soft open, hard opening coming June 14th, Sanctum, the healing center here under the Natural Medicine Health Act in Colorado, the model that we're choosing to focus on is very much focused on that longer container of prep and integration in either a therapeutic or a coaching-based container because the results are so much better. But I already see what you're talking about, which is people who are seeking a quick fix and a reminder that the medicine is not the silver bullet. It's the work that you do that they empower that ultimately creates change, and making that investment of time and the money to have that professionally trained person with you. It's more upfront, but in the long run, it's more beneficial. So I'm feeling those same wins right now. Yeah.
Yeah, it is true. It's more upfront, but you save more in the end.
Yeah. So psychedelicscience.org is the website where you could go buy tickets. I don't know this. If there are folks who, are out of state or can't afford a ticket, are there ways for them to interact with the conference digitally or freely?
We are going to put everything up on the web for free shortly after the conference is over.
Wow. Beautiful. Anything else people should know about the event?
Yeah, it's just like a celebration of how much is going on.
Yeah.
Despite the FDA setbacks, it's another opportunity for networking, for people to really touch in with what's happening everywhere and realize we're part of some bigger movement towards consciousness. I ended my TED Talk in 2019 saying that humanity is in a race between consciousness and catastrophe. And psychedelics are here to help consciousness win.
Amen to that. So I want to close kind of in that vein. Consciousness is not bound by the stories we bought into when we were children. It's not bound by political ideology. It's not bound by experience. It's the connective tissue that brings us all together. And I had the great pleasure to be at a conference a couple weeks ago in a room with probably 80% conservative, Republican or libertarian political leaders, a room that when I was in my 20s, I would have never imagined would have been in. And because I was in that room and there was shared overlap and interest around healing, I got to see those individuals not through the funhouse mirror of the media or the attack ads of the opposing party, but as human beings. And they're beautiful human beings who cared. And now I look at the landscape and I'm looking at a number of the appointees in the Trump administration, from RFK to Doug Collins to Jim O'Neill. You mentioned Rick Perry. And at least in my kind of shock and evaluation, there seems to be maybe more of an opening coming from the conservative side of the aisle than there may have been on the Democratic side. And that's not a judgment. It's just an observation that maybe is incorrect. But I think I found myself going like, wow, that's surprising. And might these psychedelic medicines actually be that connective tissue to allow us to start to see each other as humans again across difference? And these are seeds that you laid well over a decade ago, but I just interviewed Brian Hubbard, and he talked about his like absolute admiration and love for you and the words that you've used and your link through the spiritual component of this work, even though unquestionably you may disagree on so many other political things, but you can find each other's humanity.
Yeah.
And I find that just so beautiful. And I wonder if you could kind of close us out by just talking about that in any way that calls you.
That's really great. And I think that was what really drew me to psychedelics in the first place in 1972 when I was 18 and read Stan Grof's Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research, is this sense of going beyond yourself and feeling you're part of something bigger. So maybe I can talk about this in terms of Abraham Maslow. A lot of people have heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you're taught this in basic psychology classes. But what people are taught is that it's sort of the survival needs, belonging needs, self-esteem needs, and then you move up to the top, which is self-actualization. You become your full self. And that's what's really taught. But what people don't realize is in the last few years of his life, Abraham Maslow, who had started humanistic psychology, the human potential movement, that he encountered Stan Grof and he encountered the findings from LSD research. And he ended up changing his hierarchy of needs. Mm-hmm. And so what became the top over self-actualization was self-transcendence. You become beyond yourself to realize we're part of something much bigger. We're all interconnected, and you need to pay attention to that. And so that, I think, is where we want humanity as a whole to grow, that we won't tolerate so many people in poverty and starving and warfare to the same extent, that we'll be more interconnected, we'll be better able to protect the environment. That's the big hope for psychedelics, is to move to this self-transcendent state. It doesn't mean that you're not paying attention to yourself. It just means that you're not the ultimate goal. And so I think that's the real part, that psychedelics have this unique opportunity. By unique, I don't mean that you can't get to it other ways. You can get to it through meditation, through fasting, through sex, through gratuitous grace, all sorts of different ways that people can access things. But there's a uniquely reliable, powerful use for psychedelics. In a world hungry for connection, well-managed psychedelic experiences can offer that connection.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, I just want to say thank you to you for the work you've done over the course of my entire life and more on this issue, for the seeds that you have sown with others of not just bipartisanship, but post-partisanship, that we're all humans, that we have different perspectives. We're going to disagree, good. But if we can do it as humans focused on a shared goal and alleviating human suffering and increasing human flourishing, then it shouldn't be a threat that we disagree. It should be an opportunity. And I can't overstate my appreciation, admiration of you, for all the work you've done, and everyone else has been part of it. Is there anyone else you'd want to shout out and just give a little, when you work with so many remarkable folks, anyone else you'd want to celebrate a little bit?
I guess I'll speak to Bessel van der Kolk for the moment. He wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
Came out in 2014. It's still among the New York Times bestsellers. People have become aware of how much trauma is behind everything. And so his book has been a phenomenal success. And he was principal investigator of our phase 3 site, and initially said, don't work with people that have complex trauma. They're the hardest to treat. It's going to make your data not look so good. And we said, no, we will work with them. We know it works with them. And then he said, well, let me add some measures of self-compassion, self-efficacy, self-experience, alexithymia, whether you're in touch with your emotions, things. And what he's discovered is that what he thinks is among the best things that there is for treating PTSD is MDMA. And that the people high on the dissociative subtype, or people that are never felt safe, that always had complex trauma, that they actually get the most benefit from it.
That's awesome. Beautiful. So final closing question, very quick, same for every guest, which is that our audience are not passive observers. These are proverbial humans in the arena. And if you were to leave them with just one thing, one thought, one quote, one charge, anything that would best resource them to personally be a vector for healing our politics, what would you leave them with?
There's a statement that sometimes things seem impossible before they become inevitable. If a vision makes sense for you, even if everybody else thinks it'll never happen, and even if you think it might never happen, if it's enough to give you meaning and purpose, that's something to try to implement. There's this famous quote about Margaret Mead about people think that a few people banded together can never really make change. But she said, actually, that's the only thing that works.
That's right.
So I think, start something, and you'll never know 38 years later what the world will look like.
Gosh. Thank you so much for your time, for your effort, for everything that you do, and for who you are. You wear it with grace and joy and kindness and generosity in a way that is fairly rarely seen in someone in your position. So thank you.
Thank you, Skippy. And I'll just end with an invitation to people to come to Psychedelic Science 2025. And also, if they want to donate to MAPS and become a member of any amount, I'd like to just maps.org, and you'll learn an enormous amount about what we've been doing.
Anywhere else that they can follow, find, work with, any contact, anything at all that you'd want people to be able to wayfind to the organization?
Just come to maps.org, and there are links going all out to all different things.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to put what you've heard here today into practice, sign up for our newsletter, The Leader's Handbook.
where each month you'll receive just one email with a curated selection of the most useful tools and practices discussed on this podcast today and over the course of the last month, delivered in simple how-to worksheets, videos, and audio guides, so you and your teams can try and test these out in your own life and see what best serves you. And lastly, if you want to be a vector for healing our politics, if you want to do your part, take out your phone right now and share this podcast with 5 colleagues you care about. Send a simple text, drop a line, and leave the ball in their court. Because the truth is, the more those around you do their work, the better it will show up in your life, in your community, and in your world. Have a beautiful day. The Healing Our Politics podcast is brought to you by the Elected Leaders Collective, the first leading and most highly recognized name in mental health, well-being, and performance coaching for elected leaders and public servants, designed specifically for you. Now, don't be fooled by the name. The Elected Leaders Collective is not just for elected leaders. It is for all public servants, staffers, volunteers, government, nonprofit, whole organizations. This is for you. If you are filled with passion for improving your community and world, but are tired, as I am, of the anger, stress, and vitriol, if you find yourself banging your head against that same wall, struggling with the incoming criticism and threats, arguing with colleagues who are supposed to be on your team, and questioning if it's even worth it anymore, then the Elected Leaders Collective programming is specifically for you. With the Elected Leaders Collective, you will learn to become a hashtag political healer, building the authentic, unshakable confidence and courage to stay true to yourself through the anger and pressure, while cultivating the open, empathetic mind to meet others with the curiosity, compassion, and kindness necessary to respond to threats, improve challenging relationships, de-escalate conflict, and bring people in your community together to solve real problems and get shit done. You'll reduce stress, anxiety, and overwhelm and become a more effective leader while having time for your family, yourself, your health, and your wealth, sleeping well at night, and showing others they can too. Now that's leadership. Healing Our Politics listeners receive 10% off all Elected Leaders Collective services using the code hashtag political healer. Use it today and become one of the brave political leaders healing our politics. Use code hashtag political healer by going to www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. That's www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. As leaders, we all face contentious situations. As an Aspen City Councilman, I navigated some of the most contentious STR and land use conversations in a generation. And while most were engaged in a food fight, profit versus community, Skyrun Vacation Rentals, a company built on community-first values for 20 years that I know personally, helped me find a solution that created positive outcomes for everyone. If you want responsible vacation rentals in your community to strengthen the local economy, Skyrun is the vacation rental company for you. To experience their commitment to care and community up close, use code HOP15, that's Healing Our Politics 15, for 15% off a stay at one of their locations, whether for yourself or someone in your community. There's a link in the show notes below. Feel free to share it.